I didn't plan on telling this story. Even now, saying it out loud feels like dragging something out of the dirt that should have stayed buried. But there are nights when the wind presses against my Volkswagen's thin metal frame just the way it did up in the Appalachian Mountains, and it all comes back so sharply, it feels like the forest wants me to remember. My name's Caleb, 34, originally from eastern Kentucky, raised around hollers where people disappear between one breath and the next, and no one calls it unusual because the mountains have their own appetite. Back then, I thought I understood those hills. I grew up camping, hunting, driving back roads with my old man, listening to him talk about folk stories that were older than the cemeteries hidden under the kudzu. But you never really understand this land until you spend a night in it alone, truly alone, with nothing but the whisper of your own breath and the growing suspicion that something else is listening. I'd been living out of my Volkswagen for a year by then, drifting between national forests, taking odd jobs, filming my camping trips for the small YouTube channel I used to run. Mostly harmless stuff, showing good campsites, sharing survival tips, telling the occasional eerie campfire tale from locals I met. But the Appalachians didn't want to be filmed, or maybe they wanted something else entirely. That trip was supposed to be simple. A week near the Tennessee-North Carolina border, somewhere between Roan Mountain and a cluster of old trails the Forest Service didn't maintain anymore. Folks in a nearby town said hikers had gone missing there over the years, mostly out-of-towners, people who didn't know the land's personality. That should have made me cautious. Instead, it made me curious, foolish kind of curious. The first day was fine. The drive up a narrow gravel road, the kind where brush drags along both sides of the car like fingers pulling you inward. My Volkswagen shook over potholes but held together like she always had. The air smelled like wet stone and decaying leaves, a smell that feels older than you are, older than everyone you've ever known. I picked a small clearing about a quarter mile off the old road. Quiet, tucked away, the kind of place that makes you feel like the world has finally stopped spinning. But even unloading my gear, I felt this unease, like the forest was holding its breath, like it was waiting on me to make the first mistake. I brushed it off, told myself I was just tired. The quiet can mess with you out here, especially mountain quiet, where sound doesn't travel right. Echoes bounce wrong, distance feels distorted. You can hear something that sounds close when it's far, and something that sounds far when it's just behind you. That night, I built a small fire, watched the smoke rise straight up in a perfect line, no breeze at all. The forest around me didn't sing the way it usually does. No crickets, no frogs, not even the rustle of something small in the brush. Silence so complete it felt like sound itself had died. I was sitting by the fire when I heard it, a woman's voice, soft, almost conversational, saying a name I didn't recognize, Elias. Just that. Spoken like a mother calling someone for dinner. Calm, familiar, and close, too close. I froze. I didn't even breathe. My ears strained to catch more, but the woods swallowed the sound whole like it had never existed. When I finally turned, the darkness behind my van looked thicker, heavier. I reached for my flashlight, but my hand shook hard enough that I dropped it into the dirt. I told myself it was an echo from somewhere down the ridge, maybe a hiker, maybe someone camping deeper in, but it didn't feel like an echo. It felt directed, meant for ears, meant for my ears even if the name wasn't mine, and the worst part wasn't hearing it. It was how familiar the tone sounded, like I'd heard that voice somewhere before, like memory was trying to break the surface. Around midnight, I crawled into the van to sleep. Locked the doors, even though it was stupid. Anything that wanted in could break glass or metal. But the lock made me feel like I had some control. I lay there listening to the faint crackle of the dying fire and the breath of the mountain wind finally returning, pushing softly against the walls of the van. I must have drifted off because I shot awake to the sound of footsteps circling the vehicle. Slow, measured, crunching in the leaf litter like someone trying not to be noticed. I didn't move at first. I barely even blinked. I just stared out the window, but it was too dark to see anything except silhouettes of trees pressed against the sky. The footsteps stopped by my driver's side door, and that's when I smelled it, this faint scent of damp soil, almost like someone had been lying in the ground, not earthy in the normal way. Heavier, sweet, rotting at the edges. Then a whisper came through the glass, not words, just breath. A soft exhale like someone fogging up a window to draw on it. Every inch of my body froze. My instincts screamed to run, but there was nowhere to go, not without stepping out into whatever was waiting. My chest tightened until it hurt. My fingers dug into the sleeping bag, and I remember thinking, with terrifying clarity, they're looking for someone, and they think it's me. A few minutes passed, long, quiet, unbearable minutes. Then the footsteps moved again, slow, dragging. They circled the van once more, then faded into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Not really. Every sound became a threat. Every shadow stretched too long, and in the half-light before dawn, I heard that woman's voice again, farther away this time, but still calling the same name, Elias. Only this time, it sounded angry or disappointed or both. When the sun finally rose, the forest seemed normal again. Birds calling, light cutting through fog. For a moment, I almost convinced myself I dreamed everything. Almost. Until I stepped outside and saw the footprints. One set of prints, bare feet. Human, small, like a woman's, circling the van twice, stopping at my driver's side door. And that's when I realized something else, something far worse. There were no prints leading in, and none leading out. As if she'd just appeared there beside me in the night, as if the mountain had spat her out of the soil and swallowed her again before sunrise. I should have left then, packed up, driven out, told myself I'd had a close call and learned a lesson. But the prints bothered me, haunted me. They were wrong in a way I couldn't explain, too deep, like whoever made them was heavier than a normal person, like someone carrying the weight of the earth itself. Something inside me wouldn't let it go. Maybe curiosity, maybe pride, maybe that stubborn mountain-born part of me that refused to be scared off my own land. So I stayed another night. God help me, I stayed. And that was the night everything went from uneasy to something I still can't explain without feeling the forest leaning in to listen. I spent the morning pretending everything was normal. Brewed coffee on my little propane stove. Walked the perimeter of my clearing like I was checking for bears or coyotes, even though I knew damn well that whatever visited me last night didn't walk on four legs. The footprints were still there, deeper than before somehow, like the ground softened around them overnight while every other patch of soil stayed firm. I tried to joke with myself, saying fear was making me see things, making me imagine depth where there wasn't any. But the truth was simpler and much harder to swallow. Those prints didn't look like they had been stepped into the earth. They looked like they had risen up from underneath it. Still, I kept telling myself the same lie every camper with a little too much pride tells themselves. I'm fine. I can handle this. The mountains can't scare me. I packed up a small day bag and followed an old trail that slipped down the ridge like a spine. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. Even the birds cut their songs short, their calls sounding clipped and undecided. I walked for maybe half an hour before I saw something that made the hair crawl on the back of my neck. Hanging from a low pine branch was a strip of white fabric, thin, almost translucent, like the hem of a nightgown. I stopped, looked around. The forest was still, watching. I didn't want to touch it, but curiosity always wins when it shouldn't. The fabric felt cold, too cold, like touching the inside of a freezer. My spine tightened. I dropped it instantly. The air around it felt wrong, dense, weighted, like a pocket of the forest that refused to warm with the sun. I should have gone back then, but instead I kept going, drawn by this gnawing sense that the woods were keeping something from me, and I needed to understand what it was. 10 more minutes and I reached a small clearing, if you could even call it that. A ring of stone half buried in moss and leaves. Not a fire ring. Not natural either. Worked stone, stacked deliberately. And in the center, carved into a slab so weathered it was nearly illegible, was a name. Elias Hunter, 1854-1878. A grave. Out here in the middle of nowhere. No path leading to it. No sign anyone had tended it for over a century. But that wasn't the part that stopped my breath. Someone recently had placed small items on the stone. A rusted hair clip. A smooth pebble. A strip of faded ribbon. A child's marble. Tokens of remembrance. Offerings. Fresh. Clean of leaves. Not yet sunk into the dirt, which meant someone had been here. Not last year. Not last month. Recently. I felt watched. Not in the normal way where paranoia plays tricks on you. No, this felt intentional. Like the forest had a pair of lungs and it was holding its breath just for me. I backed away, step by careful step. The trees seemed to close in, leaning slightly like they wanted to listen to the sound of my heartbeat. By the time I got back to camp, sweat soaked the back of my shirt even though the air was cool. The Volkswagen looked small and fragile against the wall of trees. I didn't know what terrified me more. The grave, the offerings, the fact that the woman's voice from last night had spoken that same unusual name, or that some part of me wondered if she wasn't calling for Elias, but calling him back. I pushed through the afternoon trying to keep myself busy, reorganized gear, gathered firewood, tried to film a little update for my channel, but stopped halfway because the footage felt wrong. Not the lighting, not the sound, just wrong. The forest behind me didn't look like the forest I'd walked through earlier. The shadows were too long. They pointed the wrong direction. By dusk, tension had settled in the air like fog. I made a fire larger than usual, wanting the warmth, needing the comfort of something predictable. But even the flames spit strangely, flickering in quick bursts as if reacting to something I couldn't see. When full darkness came, the silence deepened in a way I'd never felt. I sat in my folding chair, leaning forward, ears straining. I didn't want to hear anything, but I also needed to know if something was creeping toward me again. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time felt thick and syrupy out there. At some point, the fire dimmed to coals, and I knew I needed to add wood. But I didn't want to stand, didn't want my back exposed. The woods felt alive, breathing. When the first sound finally came, it wasn't footsteps. It wasn't a voice. It was humming, soft, slow. A woman's voice carrying a tune older than memory, not sad, not happy. Something in between. A lullaby sung by someone who didn't want the child to sleep. The melody wrapped around my clearing in a perfect circle, coming from everywhere and nowhere. I stood, not meaning to. My knees shook so badly I knocked into the chair. The humming paused, and then the voice spoke. Elias. But this time, it wasn't curious. It wasn't searching. It was closer. I backed toward the Volkswagen, my hands scrambling for the door handle behind me. I didn't even dare turn around. The voice came again. Elias, you shouldn't be out here. My fingers finally closed on the handle. I yanked the door open, dove inside, slammed it shut, locked it twice, even though that meant nothing against whatever this was. The humming resumed, this time louder, like she was standing just outside the glass, like she was circling the van again. I curled into the driver's seat, gripping the wheel as if it could anchor me. My breath fogged the window. But then slowly, another line of fog appeared higher on the glass, a breath not my own. A shadow moved along the outside. A silhouette of a woman, thin, barefoot, hair hanging wet and long. She stopped at my window, leaned, exhaled, just one long, steady breath that left a damp circle on the glass. Then the voice came again, clear as the night air around us. You don't remember me, do you? My blood went cold, because the tone, the shape of that sentence, sparked a memory I didn't want, a childhood one. A story my grandmother told me when I was too young to understand fear the way adults do. She used to speak about a woman in the mountains who called lost souls back to their graves. A woman who died waiting for someone named Elias, her brother, some said her son in other versions. A woman who never forgave the mountains for keeping his body hidden. My grandmother said the woman still wandered certain ridges, calling his name, calling anyone's name if they listened too long. And once you heard her, you were marked. You were mistaken for her lost one. You were claimed. The humming stopped. The shadow outside my window grew still. Then she whispered, barely audible, "You came back to me." Something inside me snapped. Panic finally tore through every layer of denial I had wrapped myself in. I shoved the keys into the ignition so fast I dropped them onto the floor. My hands scrambled blindly, the metal jingling somewhere near the pedals, while my eyes stayed locked on the silhouette outside. My breath came in sharp gasps. My chest seized. I reached down, grabbed the keys, slammed them into the ignition again. The van roared to life, and that was when the silhouette moved. Fast. Too fast. One moment by the window. The next, standing in front of the van's headlights, staring at me without eyes I could see. She lifted one hand, palm out, almost asking me to stop. But survival drowned out everything. I threw the van into drive, the wheels spun in the leaves, caught, and I shot forward, the light slicing through her shape. Except she didn't disappear. She didn't jump aside. She didn't scream. She passed through the beam as if she were made of the forest's breath itself. My heart slammed against my ribs. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The road was a blur of roots and gravel. Branches slapped the sides of the vehicle. Every turn felt wrong, like the mountain was shifting beneath me. But I kept driving, faster, deeper into the night, until the road ahead ended abruptly, not in a drop, not in a ravine, but in something far more terrifying. My own campsite, my own burnt-out fire, my own footprints. The mountain had looped the road. I hadn't escaped at all. I slammed the brakes so hard loose gear flew off the passenger seat, thudding against the dashboard. The van skidded sideways, dirt spraying up in a cloud. The clearing unfolded in front of me like a twisted joke, the same ring of packed soil, the same dying fire, the same log I'd dragged over to sit on. I stared at it in disbelief, my breath heaving, hands shaking on the steering wheel so violently the column rattled. There was no way I'd turned around. I hadn't reversed. I hadn't circled. I'd driven straight through the mountain's belly, fast enough, wild enough, desperate enough that I should have been miles from that spot. But the campsite sat there in the headlights, calm and still, as if it had been waiting patiently for me to return. I killed the engine, left the headlights on. The forest swallowed the beams at the edges, the trees leaning as if they were listening to the hum of the motor fading away. I whispered to myself, "No, no, no, no." Like repetition could undo geography, like denial could rearrange the land beneath my tires. Something about the air was different, thicker, heavier. When I stepped out, the first thing I noticed was the smell, rich, wet soil, the kind that clings to the back of your throat. The smell of something that has been pulled from the earth. And then I saw the footprints, not the ones from last night, new ones, dozens, circling, layered, overlapping like a congregation had walked around my camp again and again in the darkness, all bare, all small, all pointing inward toward the fire pit. And in the center of the pit, where the fire had burned low but still glowed faintly, something white sat on the coals. Not burning, not curling from heat. A nightgown. The exact same fabric I had found hanging from the pine branch only hours earlier. I stumbled backward, almost falling over my own pack. My headlights flickered, dimmed for a moment, then brightened again, illuminating the pale cloth more clearly. It wasn't just lying there. It was placed, carefully folded, like someone had laid it down gently, reverently asking the flames to take it. But the fire refused. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place. Long enough for the forest to shift. Long enough for the silence to turn from oppressive to expectant. The night thickened, bending around the clearing like the woods were tightening their grip. A twig snapped behind me. Sharp, deliberate. Not an animal, not a falling branch. Footsteps meant to be heard. I didn't turn around. Couldn't. My body locked in place as adrenaline surged up my spine, making my vision pulse at the edges. Every instinct I had screamed not to look. Another step, closer, slow. A woman's voice broke the stillness, floating like mist across the clearing. "You found him." Heat evaporated from my body. Every hair on my arm stood straight. The voice wasn't angry anymore. It was grateful. I forced myself to turn, inch by shaking inch, and when I finally faced the trees behind me, the breath left my lungs in a violent rush. She stood halfway between shadow and light, barefoot, long matted hair hanging like wet moss. Her nightgown the same pale fabric lying on the fire, hands at her sides, head tilted, watching me with a face that shifted between ages, young for one heartbeat, older the next, like memory flickering through her skin. Her eyes weren't empty. They were deep. Too deep. Like someone had carved windows straight into the mountain soil. I tried to speak, tried to say anything, but my voice cracked and died in my throat. She stepped forward, one bare foot into the dirt, then another. Not floating, not gliding, walking, like something trying to remember how legs worked, how bones should move. "Elias never made it home," she whispered. "You know that, don't you?" I shook my head violently, backing up until I hit the van's bumper. "I'm not him," I managed to force out. "I'm not Elias." Her lips didn't move at first. For a long moment she just stared, and then, slowly, a sad, broken smile crept across her face. "But you came back to his resting place," she said softly. Just like I asked. I didn't know what she meant until I remembered the grave on the ridge, Elias Hunter, the stone, the offerings, the way the forest had seemed to hold its breath. "This isn't for me," I whispered. "I don't belong here." Her smile faded, her eyes darkened. "No," she murmured, "you don't." There was no anger in her tone, no threat, just truth. And something else, something colder. "You wandered where the lost ones walk," she continued. "You listened when I called, and once you hear me." She stepped closer, the firelight painting her in orange and gold flickering across her translucent skin. "The mountain decides." Then she lifted her hand, palm out, just like before. But this time the gesture wasn't asking me to stop. It was giving me something. Her fingers opened slowly, and in her palm lay an object small and round. Smooth, a marble. The same one I'd seen on Elias Hunter's grave. She was returning it, giving it back. "Take it," she said softly. "He doesn't need it anymore." My hands refused to move. My entire body felt carved from stone. But she didn't advance. She just held the marble out and waited. Patient. Eternal. When I didn't take it, she lowered her hand, closed her fist, and bowed her head in a gesture that looked almost disappointed. "It isn't kindness to wander," she murmured, voice barely audible. "It isn't mercy to stay." A gust of wind surged through the clearing then, whipping the fire into a frenzy. Embers spiraled upward, illuminating the trees like thousands of tiny burning eyes. The nightgown on the coals fluttered violently, but still did not burn. The woman stepped backward, slowly fading into the dark between the trees. But just before her face was swallowed by shadow, she whispered one final line that landed like a weight in the pit of my stomach. "You only escape these mountains if they let you." Then she was gone. Vanished. Swallowed by the forest in a blink. I didn't move for several full minutes. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else. When I finally forced myself into motion, it was pure survival instinct. Animal, blind, urgent. I dove into the driver's seat, slammed the door, locked it twice, and turned the key with hands that barely worked. The van roared back to life. I kept the headlights off this time. That wasn't intentional. I was shaking so hard I forgot to turn them on, but it might have saved me. The darkness outside swallowed the metal frame, making the van feel invisible, unlit, unannounced. My eyes darted across the forest, searching for her silhouette, bracing for her voice. Nothing. Only the sound of wind in the branches and the engine's low rumble. It was then, through the windshield, that I saw something else. The footprints circling the fire pit were gone. All of them. Erased, like they'd never existed, except for one. A single bare footprint pressed deep into the soil at the edge of the clearing, facing away, pointing toward the ridge where Elias Hunter's grave lay hidden beneath moss and time. It was an invitation, or a warning, or both. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I couldn't stay here another second. I shifted into gear, slowly easing the van forward, terrified that any sudden movement might summon her back. The forest watched, the trees leaned, the dirt road waited, and as my tires crept toward the trail, a new thought surfaced, cold and unwelcome. If the mountain looped the road once, it could do it again. I crept down the dirt path with the van idling low, headlights still off, praying the forest wouldn't rearrange itself again. My fingers hovered over the steering wheel like I could somehow steer my way out of a nightmare if I just gripped hard enough. Every bump in the road jolted through me. Every shadow felt alive. The trees pressed close to the van, their branches forming a kind of tunnel overhead. The only light came from the faint glow of the daffodil green against my shaking hands. I expected her voice to come back at any moment. Expected that humming, or that cold exhale against the glass, or that single name drifting through the dark like a hook hunting flesh. None of it came, which somehow felt worse. Fear is sharper when it waits. The path twisted through the woods, but this time, something was different. I could feel the road beneath me staying straight, not bending into impossible loops. The air was still thick, heavy, but the tension shifted. It didn't feel like the mountain was trying to keep me anymore. It felt like it was watching what I'd decide to do next. My headlights stayed off until the road widened slightly, until the trees pulled back enough for me to risk it. When I finally flicked them on, the light exposed a scene that made my stomach twist. Branches snapped clean, leaves disturbed, soil freshly churned. Something big had moved through here. Recently. Too recently. I swallowed hard and pressed the gas, letting the van crawl forward. Every instinct in my body screamed not to stop, not even for a second. The forest felt different now, less ancient, less timeless, and more like something waking up, stretching, remembering itself. A few minutes passed in silence, the kind so complete it felt dangerous. And then up ahead, the road split in two directions. Left, toward the ridge where I'd found the grave. Right, down toward the main forest road, the closest thing to civilization for miles. My brain didn't hesitate. Every sane cell in my body wanted to turn right and fly out of those mountains, never look back, never even say the name Elias Hunter again. But my hands, traitorous, curious, terrified hands, began to turn the wheel left instead. I froze in horror, fingers tightening, jaw clenched. For a moment, I genuinely thought something unseen was guiding me, manipulating my muscles. But no, it was me. It was the same thing that made me stay after the first night. The same thing that made me follow that trail. The same thing that made me reach toward the nightgown before my mind screamed no. I needed to understand. Some part of me believed the only way out was through. My voice cracked as I whispered, "Don't do this. Don't do this, Caleb." But my chest felt pulled by something deeper than fear. I stopped the van between the two paths. Silence stretched. The forest waited. And then I remembered her words. You only escape these mountains if they let you. What if trying to flee in ignorance ensured I wouldn't leave at all? What if the only for those who ran blindly? What if the only path forward, the only chance at surviving, was to face whatever the hell stood on that ridge? My breath grew shallow, my throat tight, but I turned left, and the van followed. The path narrowed the farther I went until branches scraped the sides like fingernails dragging against a coffin lid. Gravel snapped under the tires. Fog began to settle low along the ground, hugging the valley floor like something trying to drown sound itself. I knew I was close. I felt it in my bones. A weight pressed against my skull, the same heavy, suffocating stillness I'd felt near the grave earlier. The road ended abruptly at a wall of laurel bushes. I couldn't drive farther. I killed the engine, leaving the headlights on. Their beams cut through the fog in thin white swords. The trees looked skeletal in the brightness, their limbs crooked like warning fingers. I stepped out slowly, my legs wobbled. The ground felt soft, like stepping onto something that wasn't exactly earth anymore. I listened carefully, waiting for her voice. Waiting for anything. Nothing came, just the low whisper of wind through dying leaves. I pushed through the brush and followed the slope upward. The fog clung to my ankles. My breath puffed out in uneven clouds. My heartbeat thudded in my ears like a drum, warning the mountain I was coming. Then, through a break in the trees, I saw it, the gravesite. Except it wasn't like before. The offerings were gone. The stone was no longer covered in moss. And the earth was disturbed, freshly disturbed. The dirt had been dug up. A shallow, rectangular mound lifted toward me. Open, empty. My breath hitched. A cold numbness crawled up my arms. Elias Hunter's grave was open, and whatever had been inside wasn't. A wave of dread crashed through me so violently I almost collapsed. The air tasted metallic, like blood sucked between clenched teeth. I stumbled forward, against every instinct, compelled by some mix of horror and necessity. The edges of the grave were smooth, clean, not dug out by an animal, dug out by hands, by something that remembered the feel of soil. Just then, movement flickered at the edge of my vision, a silhouette behind a cluster of young pines. I spun toward it, chest tightening like a fist. A figure stepped forward, not her, a man. Tall, thin, skin grayish, stretched taut over bones like canvas drying in winter. Clothes rotted, hair matted. He looked like something that had lived too long underground, or hadn't lived at all. His eyes, deep, hollow, bottomless, studied me with a kind of recognition I couldn't understand. He took one step toward me. The earth crunched under his bare feet. Another step. Slow, methodical. Then he spoke, not with breath, not with voice, but with a sound that felt like soil shifting in a freshly dug grave. You shouldn't have come back. My lungs seized. My blood turned electric. He stepped closer, and the forest leaned in around us, as if the trees themselves wanted to hear what he'd say next. But he didn't speak again. He only lifted one hand, palm facing me, mirroring the woman's earlier gesture. A warning, a plea, a command. I couldn't tell. All I knew was that something ancient and bone-deep inside me responded with raw terror. The truth hit me hard and cold. This wasn't Elias Hunter. This wasn't the man whose name she called at night. This was something the mountain had taken, something it had kept, something it had reshaped, and now it wanted me to run, not to flee blindly, but to run before she found me again, before she mistook me for the one she still searched for, before the mountain decided I was hers. He took one slow step back into the shadows, then another. His form melted into the tree line, disappearing with impossible smoothness, leaving me alone on the ridge beside an empty grave. With night closing in like a fist, I turned and ran harder than I ever had in my life. Branches tore at my clothes, roots caught my boots, the mountain breathed hot against my neck. But I didn't stop, because somewhere behind me, between the trees, I heard humming, growing louder, closer, calling a name that did not belong to me, and the mountain was no longer letting me leave. I barreled down the ridge like a man running through a nightmare he couldn't shake awake from. My boots slipped in mud, slammed against exposed roots, scraped against stone, but I didn't stop. Couldn't. My lungs burned. My throat tasted like copper. My heartbeat hammered so loudly I couldn't hear the forest, until I could. The humming. Soft at first, drifting through the trees like fog. A woman's voice lifting a tune that should have belonged to a world far gentler than this. But there was nothing gentle in it now. Only insistence. Only longing sharpened into something predatory. Elias, I stumbled, nearly pitching forward. My hands grazed the earth, wet and cold as a fresh grave. I pushed myself upright, legs trembling, and forced myself down the slope toward the van. The fog thickened the lower I got, swirling around my knees like hands trying to pull me down. Branches scraped my arms. Shadows moved too close. The forest pulsed around me with the rhythmic breath of something ancient waking after too long a sleep. By the time I reached the brush line where I'd parked the van, my vision blurred at the edges. Sweat and fear mixed on my skin, leaving a cold, sticky sheen. I shoved through the laurel bushes, hoping to see the van's headlights waiting to feel some scrap of safety. But the van was dark. Dead. No lights, no hum from the engine, no flicker from the dash, just a silent metal shell sitting in the clearing like a carcass. My chest tightened hard enough to bruise bone. I staggered toward it, palms slapping against the driver's side door. "Come on, baby, don't do this," I whispered, voice cracking as I fumbled with the handle. "Not now, not now." I yanked the door open, dove inside, and jammed the key into the ignition. The key turned, but the engine didn't even click. Not a cough, not a choke, nothing. The mountain had killed it. I slammed my fist against the wheel. Desperation flared sharp and hot, swallowing every rational thought in its path. I twisted the key again, again, again. Each attempt more frantic, more hopeless. The humming grew louder. Elias, closer. Elias, right behind the tree line. My breath froze in my throat. I turned toward the sound, eyes wide, vision shaking. A figure stepped out of the fog. Her, barefoot, white nightgown brushing the ground, hair hanging in wet, tangled ropes. Her face still shifting softly between ages, young, old, grieving, hollow. Like time couldn't decide what she had been or what she should be now. She moved slowly toward the van, one step at a time, gentle, intentional. Her feet didn't disturb the leaves. I locked the doors, even though I knew that meant nothing. She stopped a few feet from the van. The humming tapered off, replaced by silence so dense it pressed against my eardrums. Then her voice, calm, fragile as a cracked shell. You came back to me. My hands went cold. I'm not him, I whispered, voice barely audible. I told you, I'm not Elias. Her eyes got her eyes. They held something like sorrow, something like hope, something like starvation. He was lost, she said softly, stepping closer. All these years, beneath the earth, waiting for someone to lead him home. The grave flashed in my mind, the disturbed dirt, the tokens gone, the thing that had risen. My skin crawled. You opened the way. I shook my head violently. No, I didn't. You found his resting place. Her voice quivered with something I couldn't name. You heard me calling. You answered. I didn't answer, I insisted. I was just listening, she finished for me. A chill swept through me so violently it made my teeth ache. Her hand lifted, the same gesture as before, palm open, but this time she wasn't offering anything. She was reaching. For him, she whispered. Come home. My breath stuttered. I pressed myself back in the seat so hard the metal frame groaned. I'm not him, I repeated, voice breaking. Please, you're making a mistake. Her expression didn't change. If anything, it softened. Grief makes mistakes, she murmured. Love never does. Something in the fog behind her shifted, moved. A darker shadow among shadows. Tall, thin, wrong. The man from the ridge. He stepped forward, half visible, half swallowed by the night. Those hollow eyes locked onto me with urgent recognition. He shook his head slowly, deliberately. Don't go with her. His mouth moved silently. A single word, not spoken, warned. Run. But before I could react, the woman turned sharply toward him. For the first time, her face cracked open with something violent, something unbearable, a grief so deep it metastasized into rage. You left me, she hissed, voice scraping like broken stone. You left me in those mountains alone. He backed away, hands lifted, palms pleading. She didn't soften. Her outline flickered, like a flame guttering against wind. You were supposed to come back to me, she whispered. And now, you will. She reached toward him. He recoiled, stumbling, vanishing into the fog as if swallowed whole. Her head snapped back toward me. The humming started again, louder, sharper, spiraling into my skull like a drill made of sound. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The vibration moved through bone, through blood. Elias, the van vibrated, metal groaning under some unseen pressure. Elias, the windshield fogged over on the inside and outside at once. Elias, my vision tunneled, the air thinned. My heart slammed so hard I thought it would burst. The driver's side window began to frost, deep white veins spreading across the glass despite the warm night air. Her face pressed against the frost from the outside, hair hanging, eyes hollow, smile cracked. Her voice softened into a tremor. Come home. Something inside me broke. My body moved before my mind caught up. I threw myself into the passenger seat, kicked the door open, and stumbled into the dirt. My legs barely worked, numb from fear, heavy from the mountain's breath. I didn't look back, didn't think, just ran. The fog swallowed me immediately. My own breath felt stolen, sucked from my lungs as fast as I pulled it in. The forest blurred into motion, branches, roots, darkness, breath, heartbeat, and then, behind me, a scream. Not human, not entirely in this world. A sound of grief sharpened into something that could tear bark from trees. The forest bent with it. My legs pumped faster, my lungs tore open, my vision burst with black spots. Somewhere behind me, closer each second, the humming returned. Now a broken melody fueled by anguish. You can't outrun grief when it believes you owe it something. But I didn't stop, because ahead, through the fog, I saw a faint glow. Not fire, not moonlight, not headlights, something deeper, older. A salvation I didn't understand, but it was my only chance, and I took it. The light ahead was faint, more suggestion than certainty. But in that moment, it was the only thing in the Appalachian dark that didn't feel like it wanted to swallow me whole. My lungs burned as I ran toward it. Branches whipped at my arms, thorns snagged my shirt, roots clawed at my boots like the mountain itself wanted to drag me back. The humming behind me surged, rising and falling like breath through a hollow throat. Closer, closer, too close. Elias, the sound rattled my ribs, my knees nearly buckled. I pushed harder. The fog parted just enough for me to see that the glow wasn't natural, not moonlight, not firelight. It was pale, cold, and steady, slicing through the trees in a vertical beam. A lantern, hung from a low branch. Old metal, rusted nearly black, glass fogged from years of weather. It shouldn't have been lit, not in this wilderness. Not after a century, not with no one to tend it, yet it flickered with a steady, ghostly flame. I slowed just enough to stumble into its reach, the pale glow brushing across my shaking hands. My chest heaved, my legs trembled. Behind me, the humming ceased, completely. The silence hit like a punch. I turned slowly, terrified of what I'd see. The fog swirled in tight coils between the trees, glowing faintly where the lantern light reached. The woman's voice didn't come. No footsteps. No breath across the back of my neck. Just stillness. Heavy and absolute. The lantern swung gently as if disturbed by a breath that wasn't mine. I reached out and grabbed the metal handle. It was so cold it burned my skin. Something about that chill snapped my mind clear. It grounded me. Made me feel, however briefly, like the world followed rules again, even if those rules didn't make sense. The moment I lifted the lantern, the fog recoiled. It actually pulled back, like a living thing afraid of the flame. For the first time that night, hope flickered inside me. Weak, fragile, but enough. I held the lantern in front of me and pushed through the thinning fog. Behind me, the forest shifted, groaned, as if something unseen scraped against the bark. A faint rustling echoed between the trees, something moving parallel to me. Following, shadow steady, silent. My pulse thudded in my ears as I traced the slope upward. The earth felt oddly soft beneath my feet, like each step pressed into something that wanted to remember the shape of me. The lantern's cold light carved narrow tunnels through the darkness. The trees leaned in, their branches clawing the edges of the glow. Minutes stretched in uneven measures. Time lost shape. My breath came in ragged bursts. And then, low and sharp, a twig snapped just behind my left shoulder. I whipped around. Lantern raised. Fog, branches, silence. But I felt her. Not seen, not heard, felt like an ache deep in the marrow. A voice slithered out of the dark, not a whisper this time, not a call, just a single trembling question. Why are you running from home? The lantern flickered violently. I held it higher, knuckles whitening around the handle. I'm not Elias, I hissed, voice raw. You've got the wrong person. Please just stop. For a moment I heard nothing. Then, a sob, soft, shattering. The kind of sound that belonged to a woman who had waited 100 lifetimes for someone who never came back. My throat closed. A sharp pain gripped my chest. Fear, pity, guilt, all twisted into one unbearable knot. Then, through the broken sobbing, he promised. My breath hitched. I'm sorry, I'm truly sorry, but I'm not him. Another sob. Then the humming began again, this time slow, wavering, each note cracking like old wood. The fog shuddered, writhing around the trees, coiling into shapes that hinted at arms, faces, limbs. The mountain wasn't just watching anymore. It was listening. I stepped backward, keeping the lantern between me and the darkness. With each step, the humming faltered, like the flame hurt her, like the light pushed her away. My heel hit something solid, a stump. A moment later, the lantern's glow washed over carved stone at my feet. My breath caught, another grave marker, older than the first, words nearly erased by time. Maribel Hunter, 1849 to 1878, the same year, same last name, buried on the same ridge, or maybe she was never buried at all. A chill erupted across my skin. Understanding slammed through me like a physical blow. Maribel Hunter wasn't calling Elias because he was missing. She was calling him because they were buried together. Or supposed to be. They died the same year. Something had stolen her burial, or she had refused it. My hand trembled as I reached out to brush moss from the stone. The moment my fingers touched it, the forest exhaled. A low, guttural groan rolled through the trees, bending branches, rattling leaves. The lantern flame surged upward, burning white-hot. The fog was thrown backward in a violent rush, like something ripping away from me. A scream tore through the air behind me. Raw, inhuman. A sound of grief laid open like a wound. I spun toward it. There she was, Maribel. Fully visible. Not a shadow. Not a suggestion. Her nightgown fluttered around her like fabric caught underwater. Her face contorted into something broken beyond recognition, hollow eyes fixed on me. "You brought him to me," she whispered, voice shaking. "I can feel him. He's close." I backed away from the grave, lantern held tight. I didn't bring anyone. She stepped closer, but froze when the lantern light touched her. Smoke curled from her skin as though the cold flame burned her. She recoiled with a hiss, tears carving streaks down her ghost-pale cheeks. "You opened the grave," she cried. "You opened the path." Her voice warped, deepened, filled with stone and soil and despair. "He's awake." Something shifted behind me, a slow, dragging step. The man from the ridge emerged into the lantern light, and for the first time I saw his face clearly. It wasn't a monster. It wasn't a ghost. It was him. Elias Hunter, or what remained, skin sunken, eyes hollow, mouth trembling with a truth neither living nor dead could hold. He stared at Maribel with aching recognition and fear. "I didn't want to come back," he rasped. "I didn't want you to find me." Her scream shattered the night, a sound so full of betrayal and anguish I felt it in my bones. Elias took a step backward, then another. Fear carved into every movement. "Run," he said weakly, turning to me. "She can't leave the ridge, but you." His head snapped sideways violently, like invisible fingers crushed his skull. Maribel's voice boomed through the forest. "You don't get to leave me again." The ground trembled, roots snapped, fog surged like a tidal wave. Elias fell to his knees, and I realized the lantern wasn't meant for her. It wasn't meant for me. It was meant for him, to show his grave, to draw him back, to guide him, or trap him. The flame sputtered in my hand, dying, the cold warmth slipping away. If it went out, I didn't know what would happen, but I knew one truth with terrifying certainty. I couldn't save him. I couldn't save her. I could only save myself. The lantern flickered one final time, and I ran. I tore through the woods with the lantern clutched in my hand like it was the only piece of the world still tethered to reality. Its pale flame jerked wildly with every step, throwing fractured light across tree trunks and fog that surged like breath from a creature too big to see. Behind me, Maribel's scream twisted into something deeper. No longer grief, no longer longing. Something ancient, torn open, dragged through centuries of waiting. The sound pushed the fog ahead of it, a wave rolling over the forest floor. I didn't dare look back. Branches slapped my face. Roots snatched at my boots. The cold air knifed my lungs, each breath shredding through me. But I kept going, weaving between trees, ducking under branches, scrambling over fallen logs. Something heavy moved behind me, matching my pace. Elias, or whatever was left of him, I could hear him, weak, stumbling, dragging something behind him that scraped the earth. Not chasing me, not hunting me, just following, as if he didn't know where else to go. The lantern flickered again, trembling like a frightened heartbeat. "No," I gasped. "Not yet. Not yet, please." Because I knew it instinctively now. This flame was the only thing holding the mountain from closing its fist. A cold breeze blew through the branches, and the flame bent sharply as if trying to flee my hand. The forest around me changed, almost instantly. Slopes steepened, shadows thickened. The fog glowed faintly, pulsing like veins beneath skin. This wasn't the trail I came down. This was somewhere else entirely. The mountain was shifting. I stumbled into a clearing and nearly collapsed. My chest burned, my ribs felt bruised, and my vision warped with each heartbeat. The lantern's light illuminated nothing comforting, just skeletal trees and a steep drop beyond, a ravine I'd never seen on any map. The humming began again, slow and soft, not from behind me, from the ravine. I edged toward the cliff, lantern held high. The fog parted, revealing a shape rising slowly from the dark, pale arms first, then hair flowing upward as if underwater. She was climbing, not with her hands, not with her feet, with her grief. Maribel's face emerged through the fog, hollow eyes locked on me with a hunger that had nothing to do with violence and everything to do with longing. "Don't leave him," she whispered. My breath caught. "I can't help him." "You brought him back," she answered, her voice trembling like a wounded animal. "You woke him. You opened the ground. I didn't mean to. You owe us." The emotion in her tone cracked the air like lightning. I stepped back instinctively, boots slipping on damp soil. My heels skidded against soft earth dangerously close to the edge. Dirt crumbled away beneath me, falling into the ravine like spilled sand. Elias stumbled out of the trees behind me, his breathing ragged, body shaking. He looked at Maribel with torment etched across the ruins of his face. "Let him go," he whispered. Her eyes widened. "I waited for you." "I died." Elias's voice was nothing but despair. "I died, and the mountain kept me. You weren't supposed to stay." Her scream tore through the fog, shredding the quiet, cracking through trees and bone. The world seemed to tilt. The lantern flame thrashed violently, nearly going out. I dropped to one knee, shielding it, heart pounding so hard I felt it in my throat. "Leave this place," Elias breathed hoarsely, barely standing. "Go. Go now. I don't know the way." He raised one trembling arm and pointed past the ravine toward the darkest path in the forest, a place where the fog bent inward like a mouth drawing breath. "She can't follow past the graves," he whispered. "This ridge is her prison." Maribel lunged upward, fingers clawing into the air just inches from Elias's face. She wasn't reaching for me anymore. She was reaching for him. I didn't think, didn't wait, didn't look back. I bolted toward the direction he pointed, lantern jerking in my hand. The flame flickered dangerously, shrinking to a pale blue ember. Behind me, Elias screamed, a raw, human sound that broke apart into choking gravel. Maribel wailed back, a mourning cry sharpened into a blade. The fog billowed around me like hands grasping for my ankles. My lungs collapsed inward. My legs numbed. But the lantern's dim glow tugged me forward, guiding me through a narrow pass between two jagged rocks. The humming stopped all at once. So did the screams. Silence hit like a falling tree. The air changed, warmer, lighter. The fog thinned into strands drifting like tired ghosts. I gasped violently, my knees buckled, the lantern's flame steadied into a soft, pale glow. I realized, for the first time since this nightmare began, that the mountain no longer pressed against my skin. It had let me go. I staggered forward until the trees opened around me. There, parked crooked against an old birch, was my van. Lights dead. Tires caked in mud, a smear of frost still clinging to the windshield. But it was there, real, upright, untouched. My legs didn't trust it, my heart didn't trust it, but I forced myself forward, climbed into the driver's seat, and turned the key with shaking fingers. The engine roared to life instantly. I didn't pause, didn't breathe, didn't check the mirrors. I drove until gravel became asphalt, until trees became houses, until mountains became memory. And still, I didn't stop. Not until sunrise washed the world in gold, cutting the night from my skin. Only then did I pull over, hands trembling so violently the steering wheel rattled. The lantern still sat beside me on the passenger seat. Cold, dark, extinguished. But the metal handle was warm, like someone had held it not long ago. I don't camp in the Appalachians anymore. I don't wander unmarked trails. I don't chase stories that smell like old graves or lantern flame. But some nights, when the wind pushes against the thin walls of my Volkswagen, I swear I hear humming far off in the dark, a woman's voice calling a name that isn't mine. But one night, when I woke in a cold sweat, I heard something different. A male voice, weak and tired, fading like mist at dawn. Thank you. And I don't know if that comforts me or terrifies me more. I'd been chasing the sunset along the rim of Crater Lake for hours. My old Volkswagen bus rattling over the winding roads like it had a nervous heart. Every turn brought a new vista, Forests so dense the light seemed to vanish before it even touched the ground, cliffs that dropped away into misty blue nothingness. But there was a quiet tension, a kind of weight pressing down on me that I couldn't shake. I told myself it was just the isolation, the solitude of being alone in a place that felt almost too vast to be real. But as the sun split the sky with a golden crack over the lake, I realized the unease wasn't coming from the dark, it was coming from the light. I parked my Volkswagen on a narrow ridge where the road gave way to a sloping meadow, the tires crunching over frost-hardened grass. I'd chosen this spot because it was out of sight from the main campground, because I wanted to hear the lake in peace and not the chatter of tourists. The wind whispered through the pine needles, carrying scents of wet earth and pine resin, a smell that reminded me of camping trips with my father when I was a kid. But there was something off, like the air itself was holding its breath, and I was the only one to notice. I set up my small camping stove, the hiss of the flame filling the van's interior, and I tried to focus on the mundane. Beans, toast, coffee. Routine was a comfort, a tether to normalcy. I had planned this trip for months. A solo journey to clear my head, to remember why I loved the road, the freedom of a Volkswagen, the quiet majesty of the wilderness. But as I sipped my coffee, my gaze drifted to the tree line, and I saw it. A movement, subtle, almost a trick of shadow and wind, but it was there. Something or someone was watching me. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, maybe a coyote, but every instinct in me screamed that this was different. The shape was too still, too deliberate, and it seemed to vanish when I blinked, only to reappear at the edge of my vision. My heart began to pick up pace, a steady drumbeat of warning. The Volkswagen felt smaller, more fragile, and the forest larger, darker, and somehow more intimate than it should have been. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself I was tired, letting my imagination twist the shadows into something menacing. But the cold air pressed in, and I couldn't ignore the sensation that I was being observed. Night fell quickly, like a curtain dropping over the lake, and I turned on the small lantern inside the van. Its warm, golden light didn't reach the corners of the forest, and I felt a creeping dread that I couldn't name. The wind shifted, carrying a sound I couldn't immediately place, a low, rhythmic tapping, as if someone, or something, was walking just beyond the edge of the trees, careful to stay out of sight. My stomach tightened. I told myself I should be brave, that fear was a luxury for those who didn't respect the wilderness. Yet every instinct screamed at me to lock the doors, to hide, to pray that whatever it was would leave. I stepped outside, flashlight in hand, the beam cutting through the darkness like a fragile lifeline. The tapping stopped immediately, leaving only the whisper of wind and the distant lap of water against the cliffs. I told myself it was nothing. Just the trees, just the lake. I walked along the ridge, letting my light sweep over the underbrush, the rough bark of trees, the occasional reflective gleam of distant water. And then I heard it again. Closer, louder, not a footstep, not an animal, but a deliberate sound, a tap on the roof of my van. I froze. The wind had died, leaving me suspended in a silence so thick it felt solid. I pressed my hand against the cool metal of the Volkswagen and listened. Another tap, then another, slower this time, deliberate. My mind raced. I wanted to convince myself it was a branch, the sound of pine needles breaking under the weight of the night frost. But the pattern was too precise, too unnerving. My body trembled, a mix of fear and adrenaline that left me shaking yet unable to look away. I climbed back into the van, heart hammering, and locked the doors. I wanted to call someone, but there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. The isolation I had sought now felt like a trap. I could hear the tapping again, now moving around the van in a way that defied logic, sometimes above, sometimes beside, always just out of view. I tried to steady my breathing, reminding myself of every horror story I'd ever read about the woods, about campers alone in the wilderness. But knowledge did nothing to soothe the gnawing panic inside me. It was no longer about the lake, the wind, or the trees. It was about something else, something aware, something patient. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. I couldn't tell. The van's interior grew colder, the lantern's light flickering. I sat in silence listening, trying to remind myself that I had faced fear before. Alone in a tent during a thunderstorm, driving through snowstorms with nothing but the headlights of the Volkswagen to guide me, watching storms roll across the plains. But this was different. This was deliberate, intentional. At some point, exhaustion overtook me. My eyelids drooped, my mind drifting between reality and hallucination. And then I saw it. Not in the shadows, not in the corner of my eye, but directly outside the window. A face. Pale, elongated, with eyes that reflected the lantern's light in a way that made my stomach flip. It stared at me for a heartbeat, just long enough for me to know it existed, and then it vanished. I wanted to scream, to open the door, to run, but my body refused. My mind raced, turning over every possibility, every rational explanation, every survival tactic I had ever learned. But none of them mattered. The fear was no longer something I could analyze. It was something I had to survive. I spent the rest of the night in the van, listening to the forest, waiting for dawn like it was a promise from some higher power. The tapping continued intermittently, sometimes close, sometimes distant, always patient. And when the first light finally broke across the lake, painting the water in streaks of gold and crimson, I dared to step outside. The ridge was empty. No face, no figure, no trace of what had haunted me. Only the wind, carrying the familiar scent of pine and wet earth and the quiet majesty of Crater Lake. I packed the Volkswagen in a silence I couldn't shake. The fear hadn't left me, but there was a strange clarity in it, a lesson hidden in the panic. I had underestimated the wilderness, the solitude, and the things that might inhabit both. I had believed I could control my environment, bend it to my comfort, and for a night, that hubris had been punished. But in that fear, in that moment when I felt truly powerless, I had also learned something vital. The road, the forest, the lake, they demanded respect, not just for safety, but for understanding. They revealed truths about ourselves we often refuse to see, truths about courage, vulnerability, and the thin line between awareness and denial. I drove away from the ridge slowly, the engine humming, the Volkswagen carrying me forward into the light of a new day. The tapping never followed, at least not where I could perceive, but I knew it had not gone. It had only receded, a reminder that some lessons do not end with sunrise. And as I descended toward the main road, past cliffs and forests, past vistas that once seemed welcoming, I felt a deep, abiding sense of respect for the land, for the silence, for the spaces where the earth and sky meet, and for the unseen eyes that sometimes watch from between. I would return to Crater Lake someday, but not as I had come this time. I would return with more awareness, more caution, and a recognition that fear is not always an enemy. It is a guide, a mirror, a teacher. And the Volkswagen, my faithful companion through this harrowing night, had become more than a vehicle. It had become a shelter for reflection, a vessel carrying me through the dark toward understanding. Because sometimes the scariest roads are the ones that show us who we truly are. And sometimes when the sky splits over a lake and something looks back, it is not just the wilderness that gazes into you, but yourself. The days that followed felt unreal. I couldn't shake the memory of those eyes in the darkness, the slow, deliberate tapping against the van, or the way the forest had seemed to breathe around me. Even back in town, with roads full of cars and the hum of life, I felt an echo of that ridge pressing against my chest. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks after a night of isolation, that I had survived, and that was enough. But deep down, I knew that whatever had been there wasn't gone. It was patient, it was waiting, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know what it wanted. I decided to return to the wilderness, but not alone this time. I called my friend Rachel, a fellow camper who had spent years navigating the forests of Oregon in her own Volkswagen van. She was cautious but intrigued. "There's something about Crater Lake that gets under your skin," she said when I explained what happened, her voice low and almost reverent. "I've felt it before. out on the trails at night, it's not just the altitude or the wind. It's like the place remembers who's been careless. We planned to meet on a crisp October morning, the kind where the air feels clean and every breath burns a little. My Volkswagen, old but reliable, rumbled along the curves of Highway 62, carrying me toward the lake. When I arrived, Rachel was already parked in a small clearing near a trailhead, her van gleaming like a beacon. There was comfort in seeing her, a reminder that I wasn't completely alone and that maybe, together, we could understand what had stalked me before. The ridge we chose this time was farther from the main campground, even more secluded, a small plateau framed by pines and the distant glimmer of the lake below. We unpacked quietly, a shared ritual of setting up our gear, lighting a small stove, and checking the perimeter. I felt safer with Rachel there, yet the air still carried that same uneasy pressure. The forest had a presence, subtle but insistent, like a weight pressing against the back of my neck. As night fell, the wind began to stir, whispering through the trees in the same way I remembered. Rachel noticed it too. "It's too still," she muttered, her flashlight scanning the darkness. "Too quiet for this time of year." "I don't like it." I nodded, my throat tight, the words caught in my chest. We ate quickly, not wanting to linger, our movements tense and deliberate. Every crackle of the fire sounded amplified, each rustle of leaves a signal that something was moving just beyond sight. Hours passed with nothing obvious, but the feeling of being watched never left. Rachel tried to distract herself with stories of past trips, of wildlife encounters and narrow escapes, but her eyes kept drifting to the tree line. And then it started. Another tapping, slow and deliberate, echoing in the clearing. My stomach turned. I recognized that sound immediately, the way it carried intention. We froze, staring at the forest. The tapping moved around us, circling, never stopping, sometimes close enough that the vibrations reached the van. I whispered Rachel's name, trying to keep my voice steady. She nodded, gripping the edge of the picnic table. "It's not an animal," she said. "Whatever it is, it knows we're here." I wanted to argue, to rationalize, but deep down I knew she was right. The forest was alive in a way that was not natural. The tapping continued, now accompanied by another sound, a low, murmuring hum, almost like a voice but just out of comprehension. My skin crawled. I wanted to run, to drive back to the main road, to escape the ridge and the pressure bearing down from every direction, but I couldn't. Not yet. Not until I understood. We retreated into the Volkswagen, locking the doors with trembling hands. The van became our sanctuary again, a fragile barrier between us and whatever watched from the shadows. I could feel Rachel's fear mirroring mine, a silent confirmation that the instinct to survive was mutual. We sat in darkness, listening, counting each tap, each shift of wind, each whisper of unseen presence. Every minute stretched, every second amplified into a weight pressing down on our chests. Hours later, a faint glow appeared in the trees, a light that moved with purpose, not like a lantern or a flashlight, but something else, something that defied explanation. I wanted to tell myself it was a hiker, a camper, someone else in the wilderness. But the movement was too fluid, too precise. It circled the van once, twice, and then vanished. Rachel whispered my name, her voice tight with fear. "We need to leave. Now." I nodded, heart hammering, and started the Volkswagen. The engine roared to life, a small reassurance against the pressure closing in from the woods. We moved slowly at first, the headlights slicing through the darkness, illuminating empty trees and empty shadows. But the feeling followed, the presence circling, keeping pace, patient and silent. My hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, and every instinct screamed at me to keep going, to not look back. As we descended the ridge, the forest seemed to shift, the shadows elongating unnaturally, the wind carrying murmurs that sounded almost like words. I tried to focus on the road, on the curves, on the distant glimmer of town lights, anything to anchor myself to reality. But the fear lingered, a quiet echo behind my eyes, reminding me that the world had layers I didn't understand, and that the wilderness was not just a backdrop for adventure. It was alive, aware, and sometimes unforgiving. We finally reached the main road, the familiar hum of asphalt under the tires, a relief but not a release. The forest faded behind us, but the memory of it, of the tapping, of those eyes, remained vivid. Rachel and I didn't speak much on the way back, each of us lost in thought, processing the encounter and weighing the lessons embedded in our terror. When we finally stopped for the night, parked near a small motel on the outskirts of town, I realized something important. The fear hadn't been a punishment. It had been a teacher. It had shown us the value of caution, of awareness, of humility in the face of forces we cannot control. And it had reminded us that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the willingness to move forward despite it, to face the unknown, and to emerge changed on the other side. The Volkswagen, battered, rattling, and loyal, had carried us through the night, through the terror, and into understanding. It had been more than a vehicle. It had been a witness to our fear, a companion through the wilderness, a protector in the face of something we could not name. And as I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling of the motel room, I realized that this was the essence of adventure. The roads that scare us, the forests that test us, the nights that seem endless, and the moments when we are forced to confront the deepest parts of ourselves. Crater Lake was still out there, its waters deep and untouched, holding secrets I might never understand. And the forest had taught me that respect is survival, that awareness is power, and that the wilderness, for all its beauty, is never passive. It watches, it waits, and sometimes when the sky splits and something looks back, it is not the world judging us. It is ourselves, reflected in the eyes of the unknown, learning who we truly are in the silence between the trees. I didn't sleep much that night, but I felt a strange kind of peace. The fear had not disappeared, but it had been transformed into clarity. The next morning, Rachel and I returned to our Volkswagens, each of us quiet, thoughtful, and aware. The road stretched ahead, promising freedom, adventure, and perhaps danger, but also the lessons that only the wilderness can teach. Because in the end, it is not the road that defines us, nor the forest, nor even the fear that stalks us in the night. It is the courage to drive forward, to face the unknown, to honor the spaces that challenge us, and to emerge with the knowledge that we have survived, not just physically, but mentally, spiritually, and emotionally. The Volkswagen is more than a camper. It is a vessel for experience, a witness to our terror and our triumphs, and a reminder that the wilderness is not just a place. It is a mirror, reflecting the parts of ourselves we often refuse to see until the night grows long, the sky splits, and something looks back. The weeks after Crater Lake were strange. Even in the familiar rhythm of daily life, the memory of that night clung to me like a shadow. Every gust of wind against the window, every unexpected sound in the dark reminded me of the tapping, the presence, the eyes that had watched us. I tried to write it off as adrenaline, as the mind's tendency to exaggerate isolation. But deep down, I knew better. The wilderness leaves marks you can't see, etched into your thoughts, your instincts, the way your body reacts before your mind even understands. I couldn't resist the pull of the road. Rachel and I stayed in touch, sharing quiet reflections over calls and messages, both of us knowing that Crater Lake wasn't something to recount lightly. Eventually, I felt the familiar ache of longing, the tires beneath me, the engine humming, the wind against my face. My Volkswagen waited like an old friend, doors open to the unknown, capable of carrying me into beauty, fear, and revelation. One late October morning, I found myself on Highway 97, heading north again. The air was crisp, the trees aflame with autumn color, and yet the unease from before seemed almost to trail behind me, patient and persistent. As I neared Crater Lake, I slowed, eyes scanning the ridge, the tree line, the distant blue mirror of water. I was alone, but I didn't feel vulnerable. Not in the same way. Experience had taught me a form of vigilance, a recognition of subtle danger, and a respect for the forest that bordered on reverence. I parked on the same ridge where frost clung to the grass, and I stepped out, the van door creaking in the cold morning. The lake was still and pristine, a vast expanse of blue stretching into the horizon. I let the wind wash over me, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth. For a long moment, nothing stirred. No tapping, no presence, only the sound of my own breathing and the distant whisper of water against rock. I started to walk along the ridge, boots crunching over frost-hardened grass, senses alive in a way I hadn't known they could be. And then a movement, subtle, fleeting, at the edge of perception. I froze. Heart pounding, I focused. It wasn't a deer, not a bird. Something or someone was there, watching. The forest had a patience I couldn't comprehend, a stillness that magnified every heartbeat, every inhalation. But this time I didn't run. I didn't hide. I breathed, measured my steps, and walked toward it. The closer I got, the more I realized that what I feared was never meant to harm me, not unless I provoked it with ignorance, carelessness, or disrespect. Whatever had haunted us before was not a monster in the conventional sense. It was a reminder, a mirror, a lesson cloaked in fear. The form shifted slightly, just enough for me to glimpse its outline. Tall, thin, impossibly still, blending with the forest like a shadow of shadows. I felt the familiar rise of adrenaline, the echo of past terror, but also a strange calm. I had faced the unknown before, and I had survived. I had learned to read the signals, to move with awareness, to honor the wilderness without arrogance. And then, just like that, it vanished. No roar, no tap, no whisper, just absence. The forest returned to its natural rhythm. Wind in the pines, distant water lapping, birds beginning to stir. I exhaled a long, deliberate breath. The terror didn't leave entirely, but it softened, transformed into respect, into understanding, into a strange form of gratitude. I returned to my Volkswagen, the engine cold but waiting. I climbed inside, sank into the seat, and let the van become a vessel once more. I drove away from the ridge slowly, savoring the quiet beauty, the lessons of fear and reflection that the wilderness had carved into me. The road stretched ahead, filled with promise and the unknown, and I felt alive in a way that only comes from facing something vast, incomprehensible, and terrifying, and choosing to continue anyway. The Volkswagen carried me down winding roads, past cliffs and forests, past the lakes and rivers that glinted like shards of glass in the autumn sun. Each mile reinforced the truth I had learned on that ridge. Fear is not the enemy. It is a teacher, a mirror, a signal that there is more to see, more to understand, more to honor. To ignore it is to risk more than discomfort. It is to risk losing touch with the very instincts that keep us alive. When I finally reached the edge of town, the familiar hum of civilization grounding me, I realized something crucial. Crater Lake and the ridge were not a destination. They were a proving ground, a place where fear and courage meet, where the forest tests the heart and mind, where the Volkswagen transforms from a vehicle into a companion, protector, and witness. The memories of tapping, of shadows, of eyes in the dark stayed with me, but no longer as a source of panic. They were a reminder of resilience, awareness, and the profound lessons that only the wilderness can impart. That night, parked at the edge of a quiet campground, I looked up at the sky. Stars stretched endlessly above, mirrored faintly in the lake's distant waters, and I felt a quiet awe. The fear was still there, but it was tempered by understanding. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is moving forward, consciously, deliberately, honoring what lies ahead without denying what lies within. The Volkswagen hummed quietly beneath me, a faithful companion on a journey that had taken me to the brink of terror and back. I ran my hands over the steering wheel, thinking about the nights of tapping and shadows, about Rachel and the lessons we had shared, about the subtle signals the forest had given. Every adventure carries risk, every road carries uncertainty, but it is through those experiences that we discover who we truly are. I closed my eyes and listened to the night, the wind in the pines, the distant lapping of water, the subtle creak of my van settling. For the first time, I felt fully present, fully aware, fully alive. The wilderness had looked back at me, and I had not flinched. I had faced the unknown and emerged with something far greater than fear. Clarity, respect, and the understanding that every road, every ridge, Every darkened forest holds the power to teach, to challenge, and to transform. And as I drifted into sleep with the Volkswagen ready for the miles ahead, I carried with me a single truth. The road is never just a path, the forest never just trees, and fear is never just fear. It is a companion, a guide, a teacher. And if you are brave enough to listen, if you are willing to move forward, even when the sky splits and something looks back, it will show you who you truly are. Because in the end, it is not the shadow that defines you, nor the unknown that terrifies you. It is your courage to face them, your respect for what you cannot control, and your willingness to keep moving, even when the world seems intent on reminding you how small you are. And that is the lesson Crater Lake taught me, and the lesson my Volkswagen carried me home to remember. Survival is more than enduring. It is learning, reflecting, and emerging transformed.
The forest waits as if it knows your secrets. Even now, I can feel it pressing against the sides of my Volkswagen, the tall redwoods leaning in as though they want to listen, their shadows stretching long and cold across the campsite. I had been driving for hours, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, chasing nothing more than a weekend escape, a brief flicker of freedom. The sky had been clear when I left the city, sunlight streaming across the hood of my old van, but by the time I rolled into the clearing, the light had faded into a dull gray, the trees swallowing the edges of the road. I remember pulling into the lot, the smell of damp pine and decaying leaves filling the air, thick and pungent, in a way that made me feel like I had stepped into a different world. My name is Alex, 28, and I have camped before, but never like this. The campground was nearly empty. A few distant trailers hummed with generators, just faint music leaking from somewhere, but the spaces nearest the main trail were silent. Too silent. I parked beneath a sentinel of towering redwoods, their bark scarred and ancient, and began the ritual I always performed, folding out the beds, checking the stove, making sure the van smelled like home before the night swallowed me whole. The first odd thing was the sound. It started faint, almost imperceptible, like someone dragging a branch across the gravel. At first, I blamed the wind, or perhaps a deer, or the way my imagination twists the ordinary into something sinister when the forest darkens. But the sound persisted, slow and deliberate. I froze, straining to hear, and realized it wasn't wind. It was footsteps. Not just footsteps, soft, irregular, like someone pacing in thought, pausing, and then resuming. I peeked out the side window. Nothing. Just the tall trees, the dim light fading into shadows. My pulse quickened, the old familiar rationalizations racing through my mind. It's just an animal, I told myself. Maybe a hiker. I'm overthinking. Yet my stomach tightened with that familiar chill of instinctual unease. I had learned to trust it after years of solo trips, the times when a whisper of warning in the back of my mind had saved me from real danger. I tried to distract myself, lighting a small campfire, letting the flames crackle and spit warmth into the cold evening. The light created a comforting circle, throwing long, flickering shadows against the trunks of the redwoods. I cooked some canned beans and coffee, the mundane acts of preparation grounding me, giving the illusion of safety. And yet, even as I stirred the pot, I could hear it. That subtle, persistent pacing, now mixed with the occasional scrape or snap of a stick. Always just beyond the firelight, always out of sight. By the time darkness settled completely, I had begun naming the patterns, convincing myself of logic. It was probably a local camper, someone who preferred to wander at night. I told myself stories to calm my nerves. An older man lost in thought, a ranger checking the grounds, a neighbor walking their dog. But the air was still, too still, as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. And then I heard it clearly for the first time. A voice, low and muttering, threading through the trees like smoke. My heart lurched, muscles tensing, eyes scanning the shadows. It wasn't calling my name, not exactly, but it carried a familiarity I couldn't place. A rhythm, a tone that seemed almost human but wrong in a way that made my skin crawl. I felt my throat tighten. Something in me screamed to lock the doors, retreat into the metal shell of my van. But a part of me, that foolish part that craves understanding, made me rise and peer out into the night. I saw a figure then, barely visible, moving between the redwoods. The darkness hid it, but the silhouette was unmistakable. Tall, unnaturally still when it paused, the head tilted in a way that suggested curiosity or hunger. I should have run. I should have screamed, but I didn't. My legs refused, my mind trapped in disbelief, and then it vanished, just like that, swallowed by the shadows. Hours passed like this. Each time I convinced myself it was gone, the sound would return, more deliberate, closer. I couldn't see it, but I could feel its gaze threading through the walls of my Volkswagen. I started talking to myself, trying to rationalize the fear, trying to reason with the tension curling in my chest. I told myself that fear is just adrenaline, that my imagination is too sharp in isolation, that redwoods are natural predators of the light, of clarity, of comfort. Around midnight, the forest shifted again. A breeze stirred, carrying with it an odor I couldn't identify at first, something metallic, earthy, faintly decayed. I gagged, stepping back into the van, the hair on my arms bristling. And then I understood. The smell wasn't natural. It wasn't wind or soil. It was something alive, or something that had been alive. I sat frozen for what felt like an eternity, listening as the muttering voice grew louder, no longer a distant whisper, but something pressing against the edges of my awareness. It was a cadence, a rhythm that imitated human speech without forming words. It mimicked hesitation, anxiety, even anger, as though it had learned how to sound human. I knew then that logic was useless. The forest had claimed this hour, and I was not its master. I thought about my friends back in the city, the ones who teased me for camping solo, for trusting a beaten Volkswagen over modern technology. I thought about every time I had laughed at the warnings in online forums, at the tales of people vanishing in remote forests. And suddenly, all those stories became terrifyingly real. The redwoods were no longer guardians of solitude. They were watchers, sentinels. And this one, whoever or whatever moved among them, had chosen me. I tried to reason through it. I told myself to breathe, to stay calm. I could wait out the night. I could be silent, cautious, and eventually the thing would leave. But the rhythm of those footsteps, the almost sentient way the shadows stretched, the voice that carried just beyond comprehension, it shattered every shred of rationality. Fear became a physical presence, coiling in my stomach, pressing against my chest, crawling up my spine. By 2 a.m, sleep was impossible. I tried to escape the tension by retreating into the van, covering myself with a blanket, trying to pretend I wasn't being watched. But then I saw it, not through the window, but reflected faintly in the windshield. Just a glimpse of a tall, lean figure moving silently among the redwoods. It had no face, or if it did, the darkness stole it from view. It paused, tilted its head, and for a single heartbeat, I felt something that wasn't fear. Recognition, understanding, judgment. And then it was gone again, leaving only the forest and the ache of impossibility. Morning broke weakly, filtered through the dense canopy. I didn't sleep. My Volkswagen sat where I had left it, but everything felt changed. The redwoods, so silent and still in daylight, held a different weight, a quiet accusation. I packed quickly, hands trembling, every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig magnified in my imagination. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew it was still there, watching, waiting. Driving away, the memory of those steps, of that muttering cadence, stayed with me. I told myself I'd been lucky that leaving at first light was my only salvation. And yet, I couldn't shake the sense that the forest, the redwoods, the thing that walks after midnight, it would follow, in the mind if not in body, and that every quiet, empty campsite carries the same promise: you are never alone. And perhaps that is the lesson, the one I carry beyond fear and terror. The forest teaches patience, attentiveness, the limits of human understanding. It forces you to confront your instincts, to question the safety of your assumptions, to listen when the silence itself speaks. Camping isn't just about escape. It's about humility, about respect, about knowing that the world can shift around you in a heartbeat, and that courage is not the absence of fear, but the persistence to move forward despite it. Even now, I feel it sometimes, in the corner of my vision, in the restless moments when the wind picks up just so. The forest is always waiting. And I am never quite free of the knowledge that somewhere among the redwoods, the one who walks after midnight remembers me.
The next night settled in like a wet blanket, heavy and suffocating, and I found myself back at the edge of the redwoods, drawn to the forest even though every rational thought screamed to stay on the paved road, to drive miles away and never look back. I had to know. Curiosity had always been a dangerous companion, but it was relentless, and I felt its pull stronger than fear. The Volkswagen shuddered beneath me as I parked at the trailhead, the engine ticking as it cooled, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. Shadows stretched long across the ground, and the redwoods loomed like silent judges. I wasn't alone. I could feel it before I saw it, the same impossible rhythm of footsteps that had haunted me last night. But this time the cadence was accompanied by another presence, subtle, hesitant, almost human in its uncertainty. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself that it was another camper, perhaps a late-night wanderer like myself. But instinct screamed otherwise. There was something deliberate in the way the air moved, in the way the darkness pressed against the edges of my vision, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being measured, assessed, tested. I stepped out of the van, my boots sinking into the soft, wet forest floor. Every sound, the crack of a twig, the scurry of a small animal, was amplified, exaggerated, feeding my imagination. The first steps into the forest were cautious, tentative, as if I were intruding into a sacred space. The trees towered above me, their trunks black in the night, the canopy nearly closing off the sky. Moonlight filtered through in thin, uneven streaks, illuminating patches of moss and fallen leaves, painting the world in a palette of muted silver and gray. Then I heard it, a low, deliberate murmur weaving through the trees, familiar and yet distorted. It wasn't words, not exactly. It was more like a half-memory, a sound that my mind wanted to interpret as language but couldn't fully grasp. My chest tightened, adrenaline coiling around my ribs. My legs wanted to flee, but I forced them forward, step by step, deeper into the shadows. The forest seemed to respond to me. Branches arched closer, brushing my shoulders, and the temperature dropped sharply. I could see my breath, small clouds of white against the black of the night. The smell of wet earth and decay was stronger now, metallic and thick, pressing into my senses. I tried to focus, tried to find logic in the chaos, but each step made it harder to remember what was rational, what was imagined. And then I saw a figure, not fully, not yet, just a shadow, tall and thin, gliding between the redwoods with a grace that no human should possess. It paused, tilted its head, and for a brief moment I could swear it was looking directly at me. I froze. The forest seemed to still around me, the usual nocturnal sounds muted as if the world itself were holding its breath. My instincts screamed for me to turn back, to run, to slam the Volkswagen door behind me and pretend I had never seen anything. But something, a dangerous curiosity, kept me rooted to the spot. The figure moved closer, and now I could hear the faint scraping of its feet over the forest floor, deliberate, controlled. It was pacing me, circling, testing boundaries. My heart pounded in my ears, and I realized I was holding my breath. I wanted to speak, to call out, to acknowledge its presence in some human way, but my voice wouldn't come. Fear had stolen it. Hours, or maybe minutes, it's impossible to tell in the forest at night, passed like this. The shadows shifted, the figure moved in and out of sight, and the murmur grew, now layered with faint, unplaceable sounds. Somewhere in that darkness I could feel another presence, something smaller, hesitant, almost lost, mimicking the first. And then it struck me. I was not alone, and these were not mere wanderers. I was trapped in a space where the rules of the world I knew no longer applied. The first figure stopped suddenly. The air shifted, an almost imperceptible vibration crawling along the forest floor. I stepped back, tripping over a root, my heart threatening to leap from my chest. And then it spoke, or something did. Not with words, but with a tone that made my blood run cold. Recognition, accusation, curiosity. It sounded almost human, but it carried a weight that no human voice should ever bear. Panic surged, raw and immediate. I bolted, diving back toward the Volkswagen, the forest seeming to stretch, elongate, trying to trap me in its shadowed corridors. The footsteps followed, faster now, closer. The murmur twisted into something frantic, and for the first time, I understood that these beings, if that's what they were, knew fear, and they were feeding on mine. I slammed the door, fumbling with the keys, the engine roaring to life. The forest seemed to release me reluctantly, shadows retreating slightly, but I knew it would not forget me, that this encounter had marked me. As I drove away, the sense of being watched remained, pressing against the windows, threading through the rearview mirror. I didn't slow down, didn't look back until the familiar blacktop of the main road appeared and the trees fell away behind me. Even days later, I couldn't shake the memory. Every sound in the dark, every shadow that flickered at the edge of vision brought it back. And yet, I understood something vital. The forest had tested me, not to punish, but to teach. It demanded respect, attentiveness, humility. It reminded me that fear is not weakness. It is awareness, a tool, a compass. To survive, to move through life unscathed, I had to listen, to honor instinct, to acknowledge that some things in the world are beyond human understanding. Driving the Volkswagen now, I carry more than supplies and maps. I carry knowledge of the boundaries that exist, the unseen forces that watch, the patience required to move through fear without succumbing. The forest waits for no one, and yet it offers lessons to those who endure its trials. Every trip, every campsite, every night under the redwoods reminds me, courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to move forward, knowing the darkness is alive, aware, and infinitely patient. And still, in the deepest hours of night, when the wind drifts through the open windows of the van, I hear it, soft, deliberate, unrelenting, the rhythm of footsteps among the redwoods. And I know, as I always will, that the one who walks after midnight remembers me. The third night came like a warning I couldn't ignore. I found myself back at the edge of the redwoods again, drawn by a mix of stubborn curiosity and the gnawing need to understand what had marked me. My Volkswagen hummed softly in the clearing, headlights off, engine idling just enough to keep me from feeling completely vulnerable. The forest waited, patient, immense, each tree a sentinel stretching into shadow. I was 28, tired, and more aware than ever that fear is a teacher. But this time I would not approach it blindly. I stepped out carefully, boots pressing into the damp forest floor, my breath forming clouds in the crisp night air. The smell was stronger now, metallic, earthy, almost like iron. It curled into my senses and made my stomach churn. I moved slowly, scanning the dark between the trunks, listening for the familiar cadence, and then I felt it again, that intangible pressure, as if unseen eyes were threading through my very thoughts. This time, I didn't panic. I paused, breathing deeply, letting my senses anchor me. I noticed the subtle changes in the forest, the way the shadows shifted unnaturally, the faint murmur that had haunted me for nights, and the irregular tap of footsteps, deliberate, knowing, almost conversational. I told myself that acknowledging presence is different from provoking it, and cautiously I stepped forward. The first figure appeared, emerging from the dense darkness like smoke materialized into shape. Its form was impossibly tall and thin, head tilted at an unnatural angle. But I noticed now something I hadn't before. It moved with a rhythm almost human, a hesitant grace that mimicked life without fully embodying it. I could feel its awareness, not just of me, but of everything around us, and the weight of it pressed into my chest. I wanted to run, to flee back to the safety of my Volkswagen, but I stood frozen, mesmerized. Then I noticed the second figure, smaller, hesitant, more cautious. It lingered behind the first, shuffling its feet with a quiet tend that made it seem almost young. The first figure paused and looked toward the smaller one, then back at me. In that moment, I realized the forest lesson was not just about fear. It was about observation, about understanding limits, about recognizing the invisible rules that govern the world I thought I knew. I spoke, barely a whisper. I don't want trouble. My voice cracked, raw, but the figures didn't retreat. They responded in a way I couldn't understand, a series of low murmurs that carried emotion, curiosity, assessment, perhaps even acknowledgement. And I understood then that the forest had been trying to communicate, not to terrify me, but to test me, to see if I could maintain calm, respect, and clarity under pressure. The first figure moved closer, deliberate, and I forced myself to hold my ground. Heart hammering, I noticed the air change again, the metallic scent stronger, the forest growing almost unbearably silent, as if it were leaning in, listening. The smaller figure shuffled closer, hesitating, and for the first time I felt a strange empathy. They were not monsters, not entirely. They were something else, something evolved to understand the forest, and in their own way they were teaching me to understand it too. Minutes, or maybe hours, passed in tense observation. Every muscle in my body was ready to flee, but I remained, breathing deliberately, aware that any sudden movement could shatter the fragile equilibrium. And then, without warning, the first figure stepped aside, allowing the smaller one to approach. It moved slowly, deliberately, and I could sense the forest itself holding back, giving me a fragile reprieve. I realized that fear had guided me here, but respect would allow me to leave intact. I spoke again, voice steadier now. I mean no harm. I only want to understand. The smaller figure paused, head tilted, and in the faint moonlight I could see the outline of its face, or rather, the suggestion of one. It nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly, and then retreated into the shadows, followed by the taller figure. The silence that followed was profound. The forest exhaled, the wind rustling through the branches, and I felt a weight lift. I returned to the Volkswagen slowly, still aware of eyes, still aware of unseen presence, but no longer paralyzed by terror. The engine roared to life, and I drove away, headlights cutting through the darkness, the first hint of dawn painting the horizon in pale gold and rose. Days later, the memory persists, not as a nightmare, but as a lesson carved into my perception. I've learned that camping, especially in places as raw and ancient as the redwoods, is not about conquering fear. It's about navigating it, understanding it, respecting the unseen, and honoring the instinct that warns when something is beyond ordinary comprehension. My Volkswagen is more than transportation. It is a vessel of experience, a witness to the limits of my courage and the lessons of the world. Even now, in quiet moments, I feel the rhythm of those steps, the subtle cadence of whispers between the trees, and I remember, the forest tests, the forest observes, and it does not forget. Courage is not in defeating the fear, but in listening to it, understanding its origin, and moving forward with awareness. And so every trip, every campsite, every moment beneath the towering redwoods carries this knowledge. Vigilance, respect, and humility are as essential as maps or supplies. I will return to the redwoods as I always do, because the forest demands it, not out of recklessness, but out of reverence. Each time I set the van among the trees, I remember the one who walks after midnight, and I honor it, not with confrontation, but with presence, awareness, and patience. The lesson is permanent. Fear can teach, but only if you pay attention, only if you endure, only if you move forward when the shadows seem alive, when the footsteps are deliberate, when the night itself seems conscious. And in the end, I have come to accept this truth. The forest, the redwoods, the one who walks after midnight, they are eternal, patient, and unyielding. I am mortal, fragile, and fleeting, but I am not powerless. I have learned to observe, to respect, to endure. I have learned that courage is quiet, persistent, and aware. And I carry that with me in every journey, every campsite, every night beneath the trees. The redwoods still wait. They always will. And I will always listen. I learned a long time ago that the most dangerous places in America rarely look dangerous at all. They don't announce themselves. They don't give you a sense of the storm you're stepping into. They wait, quietly, patiently. And sometimes the only warning you get is the faint twist of unease in your gut. The one you dismiss because you want the trip to feel normal, because you want the campsite you chose to just be a campsite and nothing more. My name is Aaron Wells. I'm 37, born in Flagstaff, raised between pine-scented campsites and rattlesnake backroads. I've spent most of my adult life wandering the country in my Volkswagen camper, my little rust-patched, road-scarred companion, collecting stories, lessons, and the kind of moments that stay in your bones long after the headlights fade. And as this channel grew, something unexpected happened. More and more viewers began sending me their own stories. Locations they swore were cursed, dangerous, or simply wrong. Places they said changed them. Places they said they escaped by luck, not strength. I didn't plan to start verifying those stories. But one night, sitting in the driver's seat with a cold cup of gas station coffee and messages flooding my phone, I realized I couldn't ignore them anymore. There was a pattern, a strange one. These weren't tall tales or drunken campfire exaggerations. These were coordinates, names of campgrounds, roads you could find on any map, real places. And something in me, some combination of stubborn curiosity and a lifetime of underestimating my own instincts, made me load up my van, pick the first location on the list, and hit the road. That first place was a simple spot, Dry Creek Wash, New Mexico. Not a formal campground, just a small pull-off near the edge of BLM land where travelers sometimes parked overnight. 3 viewers had messaged me about it in the same week, describing the same detail, that at night, the dirt around their vans started to vibrate. They said it felt like someone walking in slow circles outside. One person claimed they heard breathing through the open window. Another said the desert felt alive, like it was pushing back against their presence. I didn't believe the stories, but I believed their fear. There's a tone people use when something has marked them, a quietness, a kind of restraint in their words, like they're trying not to relive it. So I went. The road out to Dry Creek Wash was all dust and silence, the kind of drive where even your engine sounds apologetic. The sky was a drained-out blue, pale, and washed thin by heat. And I remember thinking, as I followed the curve of the canyon wall, that maybe the danger wasn't the place itself, but the isolation it demanded. I parked my Volkswagen on a flat patch of cracked red earth just before sunset. The air was warm, but still, unnaturally still. The kind of stillness that erases birds, insects, everything. And look, I've camped deep in deserts before. I've been in places where the loudest sound was the shifting of sand under my boots. But this quiet felt wrong. There was a pressure beneath it, like the landscape was holding its breath. That first hour was peaceful enough, though. I made a small dinner on the stove, opened a window to let out some of the heat, tried to enjoy the view of the mesas glowing orange in the last of the light. I even told myself the stories were exaggerated. Maybe the viewers were tired. Maybe they were scared of camping alone. Maybe I was too and didn't want to admit it. But when the light finally slipped behind the horizon, a strange thing happened. The temperature dropped faster than it should have. A cold draft pushed through the van, brushing against my neck like fingers. I shut the window, but the cold stayed. And then, faint at first, I felt a tremor. Not an earthquake, not a gust of wind rocking the van, not even the rumble of distant trucks on the highway. It was softer, rhythmic, a thump, then a pause, another thump, footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps circling the van. My first instinct was denial. I told myself it was an animal, a deer, a stray burro. But the steps were too evenly spaced, too heavy, and there was no sound of breath, no rustling of brush, no shift of hooves scraping rock, just that steady pressure through the ground, like whatever it was wanted me to know it was there. I reached for my flashlight. My hands were shaking. Not dramatically, just a small tremor in my fingers I couldn't explain away. I waited for the next step, the next vibration, something I could pinpoint, but it didn't come. The ground went still, completely still. I held my breath and listened, really listened. My hearing sharpened in that way it does when adrenaline starts moving through your blood. And in the quiet, I heard something I still can't fully explain. Breathing. Not outside the van. Underneath it. It was faint and shallow, like someone lying on their back, just inches below my feet, struggling for air. My heart started pounding so loud I could feel it in my teeth. I leaned closer to the floor, not wanting to, but unable to stop myself. And when I did, the breathing grew clearer. A soft inhale, a strained exhale. I pulled back fast, hitting my head on the cabinet behind me. Panic flickered through me. Sharp, cold, almost metallic. I told myself it was the wind moving through cracks in the earth. That Dry Creek wash had small caves or hollows worn out beneath the soil. That the sound was amplifying through them, and I was just imagining the rhythm of breath. But then something scraped the underside of the van. Not a rock, not shifting sand, fingernails, dragging, slowly, deliberately. That was the moment I knew I had to move. Instinct finally punched through my denial. I didn't bother turning on the overhead lights. I didn't bother putting away my gear. I just reached for the keys and slipped them into the ignition with hands that suddenly felt too clumsy for my own body. I hadn't even turned the engine when a voice whispered from beneath the van. It said one word. My name. Aaron. My entire body froze. The sound was so thin, so strained, like someone whispering through a mouthful of dirt. I couldn't understand how anyone could be under the van. There wasn't enough clearance for a grown person to crawl beneath it. And yet the voice was unmistakable. Soft, human, wrong. I turned the key, engine roaring to life, shaking the van just enough to make the ground around me shift. And then, just as I slammed the van into gear, something hit the underside. Hard. A single desperate thud. Then silence. Complete silence. I drove, fast, faster than I should have. The headlights cut through the darkness like trembling blades. My breath wouldn't slow, my hands wouldn't stop shaking, and even 3 miles down the road, even when I could no longer see the wash behind me, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone running after me. I didn't stop until I reached a small highway turnout with a working streetlight. And even then, I stayed in the driver's seat for almost an hour, gripping the wheel, listening to the cooling ticks of the engine. That was the first time I realized my viewers weren't sending me warnings for entertainment. They were sending me warnings to help people survive. And the next location, the one I visited after Dry Creek Wash, that one was worse, far worse. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I drifted in and out, coming up for air every few minutes like someone drowning, just enough to stay alive. By sunrise, my eyes felt raw, like the light itself was scraping across them. But I pushed on, because waiting around meant thinking about what happened under my van. And thinking too long about things you can't explain, that's how fear gets its hooks in you. The next viewer-submitted location was 2 states away, Hollow Ridge Camp, Colorado. I only picked it because 3 people used the exact same phrase to describe it in their messages. It watches you back. None of them explained what it was. None of them told me what they'd heard or seen. They just warned me not to camp alone. I didn't listen. The drive up to Hollow Ridge was beautiful in that way the Rockies often are. Towering pines, crisp mountain air, roads that coil around the land like veins. But the closer I got, the more off the landscape felt. Not wrong, just too quiet again. No birds crossing the sky, no wind gusts shaking the treetops, not even the scattered scurrying of small animals. It reminded me of the kind of stillness that settles right before a wildfire explodes over a ridge, a silence built from pressure. When I finally reached the campground, only one other vehicle was parked there. An old silver sedan with a cracked windshield and no plates. The doors were locked, but the windows were fogged from the inside. I remember hesitating, wondering if someone was sleeping inside, but when I tapped the glass, the fog didn't shift. It was just there, stale, motionless, like breath that had long since cooled. I shook it off and found my spot, a narrow clearing surrounded by trees that grew so tall, their branches knotted into a kind of ceiling overhead. It made the space feel smaller than it was, like I was stepping into something enclosed, something shaped by intention rather than nature. The first few hours were uneventful. I always say that's how it goes in places people call dangerous. Daylight gives you false confidence. You smile at things you shouldn't. You brush off the feeling in your gut. And I did exactly that. I recorded some B-roll. I walked the perimeter. I tried to find the charm of the place. But even then, I noticed something strange. Every time I looked away from the tree line, I felt the slightest tickle at the back of my neck. that creeping sensation you get when someone stares at you a moment too long. But every time I turned, nothing moved, nothing shifted, nothing exposed itself, but the feeling stayed, persistent, intrusive. By dusk, the shadows began to stack on each other, merging into thick, heavy shapes between the pines. The air cooled sharply, in that sudden, unnatural way it does when a storm rolls in, but there was no storm, no clouds, not even a hint of wind, just cold. I made dinner quickly, then sat in my van with the door cracked open, listening. At first, all I heard was my own breath. Then, slowly, the forest started returning sound, not normal sound, a knock, a single knock against a tree, not the sound of branches falling or animals moving, a deliberate, hard wooden knock. I tensed, listening. It came again, but farther away. Then again, closer this time, like someone knocking their way through the woods, moving tree to tree. I stepped out of the van with my flashlight, telling myself I wasn't afraid, that I was experienced enough to handle whatever was out there. But that was a lie, a deep one. The knocking stopped the second my boots hit the ground. Silence swallowed the campsite. Then a low, thin creak drifted through the air just above my head. I aimed the flashlight up and froze. The branches overhead were swaying, but there was no wind, not a whisper. Yet every branch above my campsite moved, except the rest of the forest. The trees beyond the clearing stood rigid, still as stone. Only the ones above me shifted, as if answering to something I couldn't see. I backed up toward the sliding door of the van, keeping the light aimed upward. And that's when I saw it. Two reflective shapes between the branches. Not glowing, not floating, just reflecting my beam back at me. Eyes, human height, but too far apart and too still. My throat tightened. I tried to speak, to call out, to chase the fear away with logic, but my voice wouldn't come. The eyes didn't blink, didn't shift, didn't acknowledge me at all. They just watched with a stillness that felt older than anything I'd ever felt in the wild. Then from behind me, someone whispered, "Don't look at it." I spun so fast I nearly slipped on the dirt. The beam scattered over tree trunks and rocks. Nothing. No one. But the whisper had been close. Too close, like someone standing right behind my ear. I rushed inside the van, slammed the door, locked all 3 latches. My breathing was loud, embarrassingly loud. I tried calming myself, tried telling myself it was an owl or a trick of light or some kind of animal adaptation. But deep down, I knew the difference. I've been in the wilderness long enough to recognize predators. The forest at Hollow Ridge wasn't behaving like a habitat. It was behaving like a mind. And I could feel it, really feel it, pressing against the walls of the van, watching, waiting. The knocking resumed, but this time it wasn't on a tree, it was on my window. 3 taps, soft, patient, like someone asking permission to come inside. I held my breath so hard it hurt. The taps came again, same rhythm, same gentle insistence, and then from the other side of the van, another set of taps. Then from the roof, then from the back door. Tapping, tapping, tapping. Circling me the way footsteps circled me in New Mexico. But this time there was no ground trembling, no scraping of nails, no breathing from beneath, just tapping. Gentle, almost polite. My pulse hammered in my ears. Panic started to rise like water in a sinking boat. I knew staying meant losing control. I knew I had to move, but fear pinned me to the seat. Then the tapping stopped, all at once, too quickly, too coordinated, like whatever was out there had been listening to my thoughts. I turned the key. The headlights burst alive and froze on a shape standing 5 feet ahead of me. Tall, narrow, human-shaped, but stretched, as if whoever or whatever it had once been had been pulled upward like taffy. The limbs were long, too long. The head tilted slightly, as though studying the brightness, and its eyes, the same reflective discs from the branches, shrank against the light, then widened again. I didn't wait. I didn't analyze. I slammed my foot on the gas, tearing out of the campsite so fast the van fishtailed on pine needles. In the mirror, the shape stepped back into the darkness, vanishing between the trees as if the forest swallowed it whole. I didn't stop driving for nearly an hour. When I finally pulled onto a well-lit overlook with other cars around, my hands were trembling violently. I sat there in the driver's seat, staring at the wheel, trying to understand what I had seen. The voice that whispered behind me, the eyes that didn't blink, the tapping that circled the van like a ritual. Hollow Ridge Camp wasn't abandoned. It was inhabited, and it wasn't safe for anyone. But the third viewer-submitted hotspot, that one didn't want to watch me. It wanted to follow me. The further I got from Hollow Ridge, the more I felt the tension drain out of my body. Not completely. Fear like that doesn't leave clean. It lingers, clinging to the corners of your awareness like smoke after a fire. But distance helps. Light helps. People help. For a little while, I convinced myself that what happened in Colorado was an isolated thing. A strange, unexplainable, maybe even hallucinatory experience triggered by sleep deprivation and adrenaline. But a lie, even when we say it softly and with good intentions, is still a lie. And mine lasted less than 24 hours. Because the next location I visited didn't feel like an isolated event. It felt like a continuation. Like something had followed me out of those trees. The third viewer-submitted hotspot was one I'd ignored for months. Gravel Bend Rest Stop, Oregon. Not a campground, not a trailhead, just a lonely, almost forgotten pull-off beside a winding stretch of highway carved through old-growth forest. The kind of place long-haul truckers used to catch an hour of sleep between shifts. The kind of place locals avoided but never explained why. Normally, I wouldn't camp at a rest stop. Too exposed, too unpredictable. But this place had been submitted not once, not twice, but 9 different times by 9 different viewers from 6 different states. People who'd never met each other, never interacted, never collaborated. Their messages weren't long, but they were similar. And what unnerved me most wasn't the details, it was the exhaustion in their tone. Like they wanted to warn me, but didn't want to remember why. Most wrote variations of the same thing. Don't stay there overnight. If you do, leave before something knocks. At the time, I thought it was a cliche, some creepy internet phrasing meant to create an urban legend. Now I know better. Legends are born from repetition, and warnings are repeated because something keeps happening. The sun was still up when I arrived, filtered through tall spruce and the kind of drifting mist Oregon likes to pretend isn't rain. The rest stop had space for maybe 8 vehicles. That evening, there were only 2, a semi with no trailer and a weather-beaten minivan with a flat tire and an out-of-service sign taped to the window. The place felt wrong before I even stepped out of my Volkswagen. Not dangerous, just empty in a way a place shouldn't be empty. The forest pressed close on all sides, thick and dark and strangely soundless. Even the highway noise seemed muted, like it had to push through something dense and invisible to reach the rest stop. I took a slow walk around, stretching my legs, listening for the usual signs of life, cars, birds, the crackle of gravel under my boots. I heard almost nothing, but I felt something. That's the thing I'm still trying to put into words. It wasn't attention exactly. It wasn't being watched. It was more like pressure, a subtle directional weight leaning against the space between my shoulder blades, guiding me somewhere I didn't want to look. And when I finally did look, I froze. At the edge of the tree line, maybe 30 feet away, the shadows seemed thicker, darker, a patch of didn't match the rest. Not in shape, not in motion, not even in color. My eyes strained to make sense of it. But what unsettled me most was that as I stared, the darkness seemed to grow heavier, almost textured, like something was standing inside it. Something tall, something rigid, something patient. I blinked and the shape was gone. Just forest again. Just trees, still and old and unmoving. But the absence felt intentional. I returned to the van, stayed busy, made dinner, organized gear, anything to keep my mind occupied. Night fell quickly in Oregon, swallowing the rest stop with a kind of hungry efficiency. The semi-truck turned off its cabin lights. No one returned to the minivan. The world narrowed into what my headlights could reach, and even that didn't feel like enough. I wasn't planning to sleep. I told myself I'd rest my eyes and leave at the first sign of that infamous knock. But exhaustion caught up with me, the kind that sinks into bone. My eyelids drooped. My pulse settled. And at some point, my mind slipped under. I dreamed of Hollow Ridge, not the shape in the trees, not the tapping, just the silence, that impossible, crushing silence. And then, knock. I woke instantly, heart spiking, hands cold, breath shallow. Another knock, soft, single, direct. Not on the door, not on the roof, on the back panel of the van. 3 slow taps, spaced just far enough apart to feel human. I didn't turn around. Couldn't. I just sat in the driver's seat, staring through the windshield at the dark, empty road, frozen in a kind of internal vice. Every muscle locked. Every thought narrowed into a single point of fear. Knock. This time from the passenger side, I reached for my keys. Knock. Driver's side. Higher up, almost level with my head. Whatever knocked was tall. My breath shook. The van felt too small, the dark too heavy. I started the engine, headlights exploding outward and illuminating a shape at the far edge of the lot. Tall, narrow, motionless. The same silhouette from Hollow Ridge. But here's the thing that still wakes me up at night. The shape wasn't facing me. It was facing the forest, as if watching for something else, as if guarding the tree line or keeping something inside it. I stared, unable to move. The shape didn't turn, didn't react, just stood there, subtly swaying like its limbs were too long to fully control. I couldn't breathe, couldn't blink. A sickening realization crept over me. Whatever was knocking on my van wasn't that shape. Something else was out there. Behind me, on the opposite side of the van, another knock. Sharp, frustrated, impatient. I put the van in gear and pulled out so fast gravel sprayed behind me. The shape by the tree line didn't move, didn't chase, didn't even flinch. It just watched the forest as I disappeared down the highway, my headlights shaking from the speed. For 10 straight miles, I waited for something to appear in my mirrors. A shadow, a figure, a reflection of eyes. But nothing followed, nothing physical anyway. But the feeling didn't leave. That pressure on my back, that sense of direction, like fear giving me a compass. And I realized something I'd ignored for too long. Each location wasn't separate. They were connected, not geographically, not historically, something deeper, older, something drawn to travelers, something drawn to people who sleep where the land never wanted them. And all the viewer submissions, all those messages, they weren't warnings about different places. They were warnings about the same thing manifesting in different places. Something that doesn't stay put, something that follows movement, something attracted by the act of camping alone. I didn't understand it then, but I would, because the 4th hotspot, the one viewers said changes people, was waiting for me in the darkest part of Washington state. And that place didn't just want to watch, it wanted to change me too. I crossed into Washington with the kind of exhaustion that doesn't slow you down. It strips you down, makes you honest, makes you admit things you've been swallowing for too long. The shapes, the knocking, the pressure in the air, they weren't coincidences. I'd been followed, marked somehow, and every new place I went felt like stepping deeper into its territory, not away from it. The 4th hotspot wasn't a campground, not in the official sense. It was known locally as Old Sycamore Pullout, hidden along a damp, unlit stretch of Forest Service road in the foothills of the Cascades. It wasn't on Google Maps, and the only directions I had were screenshots from viewers. Circles drawn around faint road outlines, little handwritten notes that said things like, "Don't walk past the tree line," or "Whatever you hear, don't answer." Not comforting. But it was exactly the kind of place my viewers kept begging me to check out. I turned off the main road and followed a narrow, winding passage through dense trees that leaned inward like old men whispering secrets. Moss hung from branches in thick curtains. Fog crawled along the ground, swirling around my tires like fingers brushing skin. The deeper I drove, the heavier the smell of wet earth became, sweet, decaying, almost metallic. It was the kind of smell that clings to the inside of your nose. When I finally reached the pullout, I understood immediately why people feared it. The trees grew in a strange shape here, closer together, forming an uneven ring around the clearing. Their trunks weren't straight. They bent subtly but noticeably, as if the center of the clearing pulled at them over time. Even their roots, thick and wet with moss, curled inward like claws. My Volkswagen felt exposed the moment I parked, small, vulnerable, like the forest had been waiting for something to enter the ring, and I had given it exactly what it wanted. The first 20 minutes were quiet, but not regular quiet, not natural quiet. Quiet that felt constructed, like something had removed the normal sounds, choosing this moment to leave me alone with nothing but the quickening of my breath. I told myself I'd only stay until midnight, long enough to observe, long enough to respect the viewers who warned me. But even as I said that, something in my chest felt tight, like I'd already made a mistake by stopping here. An hour passed. I sat inside the van, trying to edit footage, but I couldn't focus. Every few seconds, I glanced at the tree line. Each time I expected, no, feared, I'd see a face peering back. Nothing, just dark trunks and a wall of green-black silence. Then the fog began to thicken. It didn't roll in. It didn't drift gradually. It rose from the ground upward, like breath exhaled from beneath the soil. I watched it fill the clearing, swallowing the bases of the trees, erasing the rocks, climbing the van's tires until everything outside the windows became a pale, shifting white. It was suffocating. My lungs tightened. The van felt sealed off from the world, encased in something that wasn't weather. Then, just like in Oregon, I felt a familiar pressure at my back. Not touching me, just urging. Guy turned. The fog outside the rear window was moving differently than the rest. It pulsed, subtly, rhythmically, as if something was walking through it. I grabbed my flashlight, heart pounding so loudly I felt it echo in my jaw. I cracked the sliding door open and took one step outside. The fog swallowed the beam of my light instantly. Everything beyond 3 feet was invisible. My breath felt too loud. My pulse felt too heavy. The world shrank to the space between my footsteps. Then I heard it, a whisper. Not a voice this time. Not human at all. It was the sound of breath, dragged through something wet, slow, labored, coming from somewhere behind the veil of fog. I turned, light shaking in my hand, trying to pinpoint the direction. The breath grew louder, closer, but I still saw nothing, just movement in the fog, something disturbingly smooth, like a body sliding rather than stepping. I retreated toward the van. Then I heard it again. My name. But not whispered like at Dry Creek Wash. This one was spoken clearly, directly, from the fog behind me. Aaron. I froze. The voice wasn't strained. It wasn't distorted. It sounded exactly like me, my own voice, repeating my name, but softer, more tired, broken. Aaron, come here. My stomach nodded so fast the pain shot up into my ribs. Everything in me screamed to run, but something else tugged inside my chest. A pull. A curiosity, a terrible familiarity, like hearing a recording of yourself from a moment you don't remember. I stepped back, forcing myself toward the van. The fog shifted. A silhouette formed. Not tall like the hollow ridge shape, not stretched, not inhuman. This silhouette was my height, my build, my stance. For a moment I thought I was staring at my own reflection, distorted by fog, but unmistakably me. It took one step forward, my body locked in place. I raised the flashlight and the beam hit its face. My face. But pale, hollow-eyed, bruised under the cheeks, as if it hadn't slept for months. It blinked, slowly, its eyelids closing just a little too late, as if remembering the motion rather than doing it naturally. Then it smiled, my smile. Only, wrong. It stretched too far, held too long, as if skin were pulled by strings. My double spoke again. We have been following you. Not I, we. The voice was mine, but layered, like two of me speaking in unison, slightly out of sync. My legs moved before my mind caught up. I stumbled backwards, slammed the van door shut, locked everything, and shoved the keys into the ignition with shaking hands. The engine sputtered. Once. Twice. The silhouette pressed its hands to the window. My hands, leaving faint, wet imprints on the glass. On the third turn, the van roared to life. I slammed it into reverse, swerving out of the pullout, gravel spitting under the tires. Fog scraped across the windows like claws. The forest blurred past, my breath came in panicked bursts. But as I tore down that narrow road, something appeared in the headlights ahead. A figure, tall, thin, long-limbed, the hollow ridge shape, standing in the middle of the path. I swerved wildly, nearly sideswiping a tree. My shoulder slammed into the door, sending lightning through my arm. The figure dissolved into the darkness. 100 feet later, another figure stepped into the headlights. This one shorter, bent, moving like it was unfolding from the ground itself. Then another, and another. Shapes, silhouettes, all different, all motionless. Just watching, some tall, some crouched, some with limbs bent the wrong way, some shaped exactly like the people whose stories I'd read. The forest was full of them, dozens, silent, staring. I didn't slow down, couldn't. The van scraped branches, bounced over potholes, rattled violently as I pushed it harder than I ever had. My vision blurred, my breath tore in and out. When I finally burst out of the forest, back onto the main paved road, the van shuddered as if breaking free from something unseen. Only then, only once the trees thinned, did I stop. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was empty, hollow, like something was missing, like something had followed me but stayed hidden. And for the first time since this journey began, I realized the hotspot wasn't a place. It was me. Something had marked me, claimed me, and the final viewer-submitted location, that one would show me what it really wanted. I drove for hours after leaving Old Sycamore Pullout, pushing north toward the coast with a desperation that didn't feel like fear anymore. It felt like instinct, like I wasn't fleeing danger but outrunning something tied to my own reflection. The sky above me shimmered with that blue-gray tone Washington gets before a storm. The road felt slick beneath my tires. My thoughts ran in frantic loops. The figures, the knock, the fog, my own face staring back at me. Every mile put distance between me and that ring of trees. But it didn't shake the truth forming in my chest like a bruise. Whatever had followed me was no longer outside the van. It was inside me. And I didn't know how much time I had until it resurfaced. The final viewer-submitted hotspot waited on the Olympic Peninsula, a place called North Point Bluffs, a cliffside turnout overlooking black waves and a wind-scarred tree line. Viewers called it the one you shouldn't visit last, and at the time that phrase made no sense. But now it felt like a warning carved too late into a trail marker. By the time I reached the peninsula, daylight was fading. The air tasted like rain and salt. The wind had that strange push-pull rhythm you only hear beside cold ocean cliffs, almost like breathing. Slow inhale, long exhale. I followed a battered road lined with moss-slick stones until the trees broke open and the view ahead widened into a jagged coastline swallowed by mist. The pullout itself was small, just enough space for 2 vehicles, but tonight it was empty, completely empty. And the second I stepped outside, the wind hit me so hard it felt like a hand pressed flat against my chest. The ocean below roared, but something about the sound felt off, like a second noise was woven beneath the waves, a low hum, faint, pulsing, alive. I steadied myself and walked toward the cliff's edge. The drop wasn't sheer, it sloped down in a steep chaos of stone and wet grass. Far below, waves crashed against black rock with violent regularity, exploding into white spray. And then, through the spray, I saw movement. Not the tide, not birds, not fog. Shapes, dozens of them, all standing in ankle-deep surf, all facing the cliff, all still. I stepped back, hard. My heels slipped in wet mud, and for a second, panic surged hot in my chest. The shapes in the water didn't react, didn't shift, didn't break their formation. They simply stood there, half obscured by mist, like shadows waiting to be acknowledged. The hum beneath the waves grew louder, and that's when I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, measured, crunching wet gravel. I turned. No one was there. But the footsteps continued, circling the van, each one landing where no weight pressed the dirt. It was as if something invisible were walking, pacing just a few feet away. My throat tightened. I tried to speak, call out, challenge whatever was there, but the wind swallowed every sound. Then, a whisper. Not from the ocean, not from the tree line, from directly beside me. You shouldn't have come alone. I snapped the flashlight on instantly. Nothing, just swirling mist. But the whisper hadn't traveled. It hadn't echoed. It was as close as someone leaning in to share a secret. I backed toward the van, heart pounding hard enough to make my vision pulse. Another whisper pressed against my ear. You brought it with you. My breath caught, freezing my lungs. Because the voice wasn't unfamiliar. It was the same voice that echoed from the fog at Old Sycamore Pullout. The same voice that said my name. My voice. I slid into the van, slammed the door, locked it, and forced myself to breathe through the rising panic. The wind shook the chassis. The van rocked gently, like something was pushing the air around it. And then a shadow passed the windshield. Human-shaped. Walking slowly, deliberately, as if testing the boundary of light. I raised my flashlight, but my hand trembled, and the beam shook so violently it fractured the shadow into pieces. The figure paused, then stepped closer, and another joined it, then another, then another. 3 silhouettes now stood at the edge of the pullout, blocking the path back to the forest road. The wind tore at them, bending their outlines, but they didn't step back. They didn't raise arms. They didn't threaten. They just watched. And as they watched, the hum from the beach below deepened, not louder, but heavier, like a vibration inside my teeth, my bones. The dashboard rattled with it. Something cut through the hum, a sound so faint I almost missed it. Breathing, not from outside, from the passenger seat. I turned slowly and froze. Someone was sitting there, bent forward, hands folded in their lap, head down, chin resting on their chest. My shape, my height, my clothes, my hair. But the face, God, the face wasn't awake. Not fully. Its eyes twitched beneath the eyelids like something dreaming in fast, frantic motion. The mouth hung slightly open, breath rasping shallow and wet, as if lungs struggled with each inhale. My double didn't look at me. It didn't move. It simply breathed, slow, pained, growing weaker, like it wasn't meant to be here long. My body reacted before my brain did. I pressed myself against the door, heart tearing itself apart inside my chest. My voice cracked in my throat, but no sound came out. The double trembled slightly, like a glitch working through the body. Then its lips moved. We're not separate. The voice was layered, thin, strained, like it came from deep inside a cold cave. We are returning. Returning. The word hit me like ice down the spine. Returning to what? To where? To whom? The van rocked. Hard. The 3 silhouettes outside had stepped closer, so close their shapes blurred against the windows. The ocean hum changed pitch, shifting into something that felt eager. My double lifted its head, slowly, like the muscles resisted, and then its eyes opened. They weren't mine. Not anymore. They were hollow. Black-rimmed, reflective but not of light, reflective of movement. Everything inside me screamed, run. Escape. Now. I turned the key once, twice. The engine refused. My reflection, no, the thing wearing my reflection tilted its head. You went to them, it whispered. Now we go back together. The van rocked again. The silhouettes were pressing their hands against the metal, not knocking, not tapping, holding, pinning. The engine finally roared alive. I slammed the van into reverse. The silhouettes staggered, distortions blurring their forms. I pivoted hard, tires screaming against the wet gravel, and tore out of the pullout so fast the rear bumper scraped rock. The forest blurred, the storm clouds cracked. Rain hammered the windshield like fists. And in the mirror for a moment, I saw my double sitting beside me. Still, watching, smiling. Then a flash of lightning illuminated the interior, and the seat was empty. I drove until dawn. Until the sky softened into a muted gray and the rain turned to drizzle. Until the ocean was miles behind me and the forest thinned into open highway. Only then did I pull over. Only then did I breathe. Only then did I understand the truth. Viewers had been trying to tell me. The dangerous RV hotspots, the places where people saw shapes, heard knocks, met their own reflections, those were never destinations. They were symptoms, warnings. Signs of something old moving across the country, something that slips between travelers, something that mimics what it touches, something that waits for people who camp alone. And I had given it everything it needed, my road, my route, my nights, my name. I don't know what followed me. I don't know why it chose me. But I do know this. Wherever you camp, wherever you stop for the night, whatever you hear outside your Volkswagen, never, ever answer when it calls your name. Because it won't be someone who knows you. It'll be something learning how, and once it learns enough, it doesn't need to knock anymore. I hadn't planned on staying at Clearwater Pines RV Park. Truthfully, I hadn't even heard of it before a last-minute decision propelled me east on Highway 17, the old Volkswagen van humming steadily beneath me as if it knew I needed it to be more than just a vehicle this weekend. Something about the way the sunlight fractured through the overgrown pine canopy ahead made me feel as though I were driving into another world, one slightly off-kilter, just out of reach of ordinary understanding. I arrived in the late afternoon. The park was nearly empty, save for a few weathered RVs with their slide-outs extended like the arms of sleeping giants. A thin mist hung low over the asphalt, curling around the tires and roots like it wanted to pull me in. The office was closed, the sign swinging slightly in a breeze that smelled faintly of wet leaves and rusted metal. I parked my van in what appeared to be the only open spot, wedged between a faded fifth wheel and a rust-spotted Airstream whose aluminum skin gleamed dull gold in the dying light. I stepped out, and the air hit me differently. Sharp, sweet, slightly decayed. It carried that indefinable weight you feel just before something unwelcome announces itself. I shrugged, tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, and opened the back hatch of my Volkswagen, setting down my sleeping bag and small pack. I told myself I just needed to stretch my legs, that the isolation was part of why I loved these trips. But even as I said it, a small part of me tightened. There was something about the way the trees leaned in closer to the road, as if listening. By dusk, I had made a small fire outside the van, carefully arranging stones I found near the edge of the forest. I roasted some pre-packaged sausages, the sizzle breaking the silence that had settled over the park like an uninvited guest. I watched the flames dance, tried to focus on the warmth and the small, contained comfort of light. But the more I stared, the more I thought I saw movement beyond the firelight, just at the edge of vision, where the shadows pooled and twisted. It started with the sounds. First, there was a low scraping near the tree line, like nails across an old tin roof. I froze, listening, convinced it was just a branch, or raccoons, but the pattern felt deliberate, too measured to be natural. Then came a faint hum, almost like someone singing from far away, broken in staccato bursts. My heart picked up, but I forced myself to breathe slowly. It's easy to let fear trick you when you're alone in a place like this, I reminded myself. Easy, but not impossible. I unrolled my sleeping mat, tucked the small propane lantern into the corner of the van, and tried to convince myself I was being irrational. I checked the lock on the sliding door twice. The sound of my own footsteps echoed louder than I expected as I returned to the fire. When I looked up again, I caught a shadow move between two pines, faster than a deer, but heavier. My stomach turned. I remembered a story a local trucker had once told me about a similar park on the Oregon border, a story about hikers vanishing without a trace. I never believed it until that moment, not the story itself, but the pulse of unease it had left in me, the same pulse that now prickled along my spine. The night deepened. The moon emerged from behind a cluster of clouds, casting faint silver over the asphalt and into the forest. I told myself the hum I'd heard was probably wind through the broken eaves of the Airstream across the lot. I told myself that the shadow at the tree line was probably just a deer or maybe an owl. But deep down, I knew I wasn't fooling anyone. Around midnight, I decided to shut the fire down. Sparks had begun to rise too high, whispering to the dark woods, and I wasn't ready to invite anything closer than it already seemed. I curled into the sleeping bag, ears straining for the slightest anomaly. That's when I heard the first clear knock. Not a branch falling, not the van itself settling, but a deliberate, slow, heavy tap against metal. The sound came from the direction of the Airstream. My pulse shot up, but I stayed still, frozen between panic and disbelief. Tap! 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 I could no longer rationalize. My eyes darted to the window, barely making out the outline of a figure, too tall, too straight to be a deer. It stood just beyond the trees, motionless. I blinked, and it was gone. My fingers gripped the sleeping bag as I whispered to myself, "It's nothing. It's nothing. It's nothing." but every instinct in my body screamed otherwise. I remembered the advice of an old camping mentor. When you feel fear that doesn't make sense, respect it. Don't fight it. Don't try to rationalize it. Acknowledge it. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and tried to listen. The forest replied with silence at first, then another sound, this one unmistakably human, the soft, deliberate crunch of footsteps over gravel, slow, measured, circling the van. I sat up just enough to peer out the side window, careful not to move too much. The firelight from earlier had left faint embers smoldering. There, barely visible in the moonlight, I saw the figure again. No face, no discernible features, just the outline of a person, or something dressed like one, moving with unnatural stillness. My stomach dropped. The rational part of my mind screamed to grab the keys and start the van, but another part, the part that always wanted to understand the unknown, kept me frozen. The figure paused, and I felt it was looking right at me. Then it tilted its head slightly, like it knew I was watching. The hair on my arms bristled. Something about the way it moved was impossible to ignore. The weight of it, the silence of it, the certainty of it. I grabbed my flashlight from the dashboard, clicked it on, and aimed it toward the spot. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing. Only the shadows swirled, stretching and contracting with the breeze. I laughed nervously, shaking, and whispered, "See? Nothing. Nothing at all." But the hum started again, a low, mournful vibration, winding its way through the trees, through the air, through me. And then a whisper, so faint I almost missed it. "Don't go." I froze. My mind raced. Was it in my head? Some echo of the local legends? Some trick of the wind? My heart pounded in my ears. Then the sound of gravel behind the van, sharp and deliberate. Someone or something was moving around the back. I tried to make my voice steady, but it came out as a strangled, hoarse whisper. "Hello?" Silence. I waited, listening. Every instinct told me to drive away, to put distance between me and whatever was circling the lot. But something rooted me to that spot, a need to understand, a need to see. Another figure emerged from the mist, closer this time, taller than the last, with the faintest shimmer of movement, as though the air itself clung to it. My mind reeled. I wanted to scream, but my voice refused. I felt the Volkswagen beneath me, steady and familiar, and in that moment, it became more than metal and tires. It was a sanctuary, a reminder that I wasn't entirely defenseless. I reached for the keys. My hands shook violently. My rational mind fought the fear, tried to ground me. A van can move faster than anything on foot. I started the engine, the familiar roar slicing through the silence. The figure flinched, or maybe it simply disappeared. I didn't wait to question it. I shifted into drive and pressed the accelerator. The tires kicked up mist as I left Clearwater Pines behind. The hum, the whispers, the unseen watchers, all faded behind me, leaving only the high-pitched ringing in my ears. I didn't look back. Not until miles later, when the road opened to the soft glow of highway lights, did I allow myself to breathe again. And yet, even now, when I think back to that night, I realize it wasn't just the fear that lingered. It was the lesson. The Volkswagen, the forest, the quiet menace of an empty RV park taught me something I'd forgotten in the busyness of life. There is wisdom in listening, in acknowledging what we cannot immediately understand. Not every encounter requires an answer. Not every shadow deserves to be chased. And not every story needs closure. Sometimes survival is in respect and in the courage to leave before curiosity turns to recklessness. I never went back to Clearwater Pines, but the memory clings like fog on the highway. And when I set out in my van now through quiet woods or unfamiliar campgrounds, I remember the weight of that night, the pull of the unknown, the precise moments where dread lingers just beneath the edge of vision, and the quiet empowerment that comes from honoring instinct, from knowing that sometimes the bravest choice is to trust yourself enough to leave. The morning after Clearwater Pines, I drove in silence. The Volkswagen hummed steadily beneath me, the tires crunching over frost-covered gravel roads that wound through the outskirts of the forest. I could feel the night pressing against the edges of my mind, a heavy residue of unease I couldn't shake. Even as the sun rose, spilling pale gold over the treetops, I felt the eyes of that invisible presence tracking me, lingering in the corners of my vision. I stopped at a small roadside diner, the kind with peeling paint and the faint smell of fried bacon that clung to the air like a promise of safety. Inside, a few locals sat nursing coffee and newspapers, speaking in low tones. I ordered a black coffee, hoping the warmth would pull me back to something ordinary. But as I sipped, I caught a man at the counter glance toward the door with a subtle tension in his posture, the same tension I'd felt at the edge of the RV park. He muttered something under his breath, and I realized he was looking at me. Really looking. It wasn't hostility, exactly. More like recognition, as if he'd seen the same thing I had and knew how it felt. "You camped out near Clearwater Pines, didn't you?" he said, voice rough, deliberate. I nearly choked on my coffee. Yes. How did you?" He shrugged, eyes scanning the room. "You're not the first. People disappear out there, not always completely, but enough. Enough to make you feel wronged by the place. Don't get me wrong, it's beautiful, quiet, perfect for someone like you who likes solitude. But quiet can hide things. It always does." I nodded, unsure what to say. There was a truth in his words, one I couldn't deny. I realized that part of the fear I'd felt wasn't just the figure, the whispers, the circling shadows. It was the acknowledgement that places like this existed outside the usual rules. That nature, even domesticated in RV parks and picnic tables, could still be fundamentally unknowable. I left the diner, my mind buzzing with fragmented images of last night. The figure, the mist, the tapping on the metal. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as I drove north, drawn by a mixture of curiosity and the unshakable need to make sense of what I had seen. The road opened into rolling hills, and somewhere in the distance, I spotted another RV park, tucked between a thicket of pines. The sign read, "Whispering Pines Campground," its letters worn and faintly moss-covered. It was the kind of place that seemed to invite stories. I parked the Volkswagen at the edge of a vacant loop, noting how the RVs here were older, more worn, their occupants likely long-term residents. A young man, maybe in his mid-20s, was adjusting a satellite dish outside a bright orange camper van. He looked up as I approached. "New around here?" he asked cautiously. His name was Tyler, and as we talked, I learned he'd been staying at Whispering Pines for the last few months, working odd jobs in town. He was local enough to know the woods, enough to sense that some parts of this park were different. "The woods," he said, lowering his voice. "They change people sometimes. Don't get me wrong. Most folks never notice, but those who do, it sticks with them. You feel it too, don't you?" I hesitated. Tyler's eyes weren't judgmental, just steady, tracking mine as if waiting for me to confirm that I had indeed sensed the subtle wrongness lingering in the pines. I nodded slowly, careful not to admit more than I could control. "I saw something out there," I confessed, the words tasting bitter. "Last night, someone or something was watching me. Maybe circling the van. I don't know." Tyler didn't flinch. "Clearwater Pines," he said softly, almost like it was a name that carried weight. "Not everyone who stays there makes it to morning. Those woods don't always let people leave unchanged. Pay attention to what your instincts are telling you. Sometimes leaving is the only answer." It was the same lesson I'd stumbled into last night, only now it was spoken aloud, in human terms, from someone who'd seen far more than I could guess. I thanked him, but a part of me wanted to ask more, about what he'd seen, about what lurked beyond the tree line. But I didn't. There was a delicacy to such knowledge, a silent contract of understanding that I wasn't yet prepared to breach. I returned to the Volkswagen, trying to shake off the lingering weight of unease. I took a deep breath, settling into the driver's seat, feeling the familiar hum of the engine calm my nerves. And yet, even as I drove toward the next stretch of road, I noticed subtle signs that the woods themselves were watching. A sudden hush in the birdsong, a branch snapping too sharply, the faint shimmer of mist that didn't belong to the morning dew. That evening, I arrived at Cedar Hollow, a small RV park tucked against a ridge where the road curved sharply. The sun was low, spilling shadows across the lot, painting the ground in uneven stripes. I parked near a wooden picnic table, unfolded my sleeping mat, and lit a small fire in a built-in stone pit. The smell of burning pine mingled with the crisp evening air, comforting and unnerving all at once. As night fell, I explored the edges of the park, flashlight in hand. The forest here was thicker, more pressing, and I could feel the weight of the trees leaning closer, as if listening. I heard the first whispers around 10:30 p.m., soft, fleeting, almost lost in the rustle of leaves. I convinced myself it was just wind, but the sound moved with intention, circling around the park. My pulse quickened. I remembered Tyler's words, "Sometimes leaving is the only answer," but I stayed. Curiosity has a way of rooting you in place, even when every instinct screams otherwise. Hours passed. The whispering grew louder, more defined. I caught glimpses of movement beyond the tree line, fleeting shadows that appeared and disappeared in rhythm with the hum of the forest. And then I saw her. A girl, standing at the edge of the woods, maybe 14, hair long and dark, eyes reflecting the firelight. She didn't move, didn't speak, only watched. My mouth went dry. I called out, but no sound came. The girl vanished before my eyes as if swallowed by the mist. Panic set in, but I fought it, focusing instead on what I could control. I checked the perimeter of the park, ensured the van was locked, and made a mental note of every sound, every shift in the trees, every flash of movement. The fear was internal now, winding through me, twisting with a mix of adrenaline and curiosity. I reflected on the 2 nights, on the lessons whispered by both Clearwater Pines and Whispering Pines. The truth was undeniable. Fear isn't always a warning to flee. It's often a teacher, showing you the edges of the unknown, forcing you to respect the limits of what you can safely explore. My instincts had saved me. My attention, my awareness, my respect for the unseen, all of it mattered more than courage alone. Sleep eventually came, uneasy and light, filled with dreams of whispering forests, fleeting shadows, and figures just beyond reach. I woke at dawn, the forest eerily silent, as though it had exhaled all tension overnight. I packed up the Volkswagen, leaving Cedar Hollow behind, but carrying the weight of its lessons with me. As I drove away, I realized that these experiences, terrifying as they were, had changed me. They reminded me of the balance between curiosity and caution, of the power of instinct, and of the strange, intimate way isolation sharpens perception. Every scratch of bark against metal, every sudden hush, every figure glimpsed in the mist, each was a reminder that fear is both a shield and a mirror. And so I drove onward, deeper into the forests, along winding roads lined with pine and shadow, knowing that the Volkswagen beneath me was more than a vehicle. It was a companion, a protector, a vessel through which I could navigate the delicate line between adventure and danger. Every campground, every shadowed loop, every misted ridge carried lessons. And sometimes the most important ones are learned in silence. Intention, in the simple act of trusting yourself enough to leave before curiosity becomes recklessness. By the time I reached the outskirts of town, the sun had fully risen, casting long shadows across the winding highway. The Volkswagen moved steadily beneath me, a quiet, reliable companion through the lingering fog that clung to the forested hillsides. But the memory of the girl in Cedar Hollow, of the figure at Clearwater Pines, of the whispers that circled and lingered, weighed on me. Not like dread anymore. Not exactly, but like a truth I could no longer ignore. Fear, I realized, was not an enemy. It was a guide. I decided to stop at an overlook where the highway curved and revealed the dense tangle of trees below. I stepped out, the crisp air filling my lungs, carrying the faint scent of pine, soil, and something deeper I couldn't name. The Volkswagen's engine ticked quietly behind me, cooling in the morning sun. I stared into the forest, trying to trace where the shadows had moved, to pinpoint the places where reality had felt off. It was impossible. The forest didn't operate on maps, on lines, on reason. It was a living, breathing presence, pressing against perception, teaching patience, teaching humility. I thought about the young man, Tyler, and the trucker at the diner. Both had hinted at knowledge I didn't have. Both had acknowledged the subtle power of these places. And now, standing at the edge of this overlook, I understood what they meant. There is a rhythm to fear, a cadence that, if ignored, can swallow you whole. But if respected, if listened to, it can show you something vital about yourself, about the world. I climbed back into the Volkswagen, the leather seat cool beneath me. I felt the familiar hum of the engine and allowed it to ground me. As I drove on, the woods receded, but the lessons remained. Every small sound, every shadow at the edge of vision, every instinct ignored or followed, these were pieces of a map I had only begun to understand. I didn't need to see the whole picture. I only needed to respect it. Later, I stopped at a small lake, its surface still and reflective. I sat on the hood of the van, coffee steaming in my hands, and let the silence settle over me. The wind rustled the trees in the distance, carrying with it a faint whisper, almost lost in the rush of the river that fed the lake. I listened. It was nothing that words could capture. It was not danger, not exactly. It was presence, proof that the forest remembered everything, held every shadow, every step, every fear, and every cautious act of respect. I realized then that what I had feared most wasn't the shadows, the figures, or the whispers. It was the vulnerability, the way being alone in a place so vast, so unknowable, stripped away all the comforting narratives we tell ourselves. Alone, there was no pretense. There was only perception, only instinct, only the fragile boundary between curiosity and survival. The Volkswagen had carried me through that boundary. It had been a shield, yes, but also a reminder. Preparedness, awareness, respect. They were as vital as courage. I had learned that being brave did not mean confronting every shadow, following every whisper, or testing every instinct. Sometimes bravery meant leaving, stepping back, and trusting that the lessons would follow you home, etched into memory like faint carvings in the bark of an ancient tree. As evening fell, I returned to a small roadside campground for the night. No figures, no whispers, only the soft rustle of leaves in the wind and the distant croak of frogs near the stream. I lit a small fire outside the Volkswagen, watching sparks float into the dark sky. For the first time in days, the forest seemed to exhale. There was tension, yes, but it had shifted, transformed into something quieter, wiser. I wrapped myself in a sleeping bag, listening to the gentle rhythm of nature, the world alive and waiting beyond the circle of firelight. I reflected on the past nights, on the weight of unseen eyes and the strange human-like movements at the edges of perception. I remembered the way the whispers had teased understanding without revealing answers, the way shadows had moved as though aware of my thoughts, the way the forest had forced me to acknowledge my limits. And in that acknowledgement, I found empowerment. Empowerment not in conquering fear, but in understanding it, in realizing that survival, growth, and wisdom are not measured by the absence of terror, but by the way you navigate it, by the choices you make when the unknown presses close. The Volkswagen, steady and unassuming, had become a vessel for that understanding. Not a savior, not a protector in the traditional sense, but a companion on the edge of what is known and what is deliberately left unexplored. When dawn broke again, I packed the van and set off, the morning light spilling across the asphalt in sharp, white lines. I knew that these forests, these RV parks, these quiet loops of shadow and mist would stay with me forever. The memories would linger, not as haunting reminders, but as guides, as markers along the fragile, delicate line between courage and recklessness, curiosity and respect, fear and understanding. I thought about the girl in Cedar Hollow, about the tall figure at Clearwater Pines, about the hum and whispers that had pressed against my perception. And I realized that the truth of these experiences wasn't in explaining them. It was in feeling them fully, respecting the lessons embedded each shiver, each pause, each instinctual surge of alarm. Some stories don't need answers. They need attention, reflection, and the willingness to let them shape you quietly, profoundly, and permanently. As I drove through the winding roads of the forest one last time, I noticed the small details, the curve of a branch against the sky, the shimmer of frost on pine needles, the the distant echo of birdsong. These details, I realized, were not accidents. They were reminders that life in these hidden places is layered, complex, and not meant to be fully understood. Respecting that complexity is a form of courage. Listening to it, even when it frightens, is a form of wisdom. By the time I reached open highway again, the forests thinning, the distant ridges receding into misty hills, I felt a subtle shift within myself. Fear had transformed. It was no longer a predator stalking the edges of perception. It was a teacher, a mirror, a guide through the unknown. The Volkswagen hummed beneath me, steady, reliable, and I understood that it had carried me not only through physical landscapes, but through the terrain of my own perception, through hesitation, tension, dread, and ultimately reflection. I would never forget Clearwater Pines, Whispering Pines, or Cedar Hollow. Their lessons were etched deep into memory, reminders that the line between safety and danger is delicate, that instinct is a form of knowledge, and that curiosity, tempered by respect and caution, is one of the greatest tools we have in navigating the unknown. And as I drove on, the road open and the horizon wide, I felt a quiet empowerment, born not of conquest or explanation, but of survival, awareness, and the subtle, enduring courage it takes to acknowledge fear, respect it, and still move forward. I realized that these forests, these RV parks, and the shadows that haunt them would always be part of me. Silent teachers pressing lessons into the marrow, whispers in the wind guiding the choices I would make, and the Volkswagen, steady and enduring beneath me, would always be the vessel carrying me through them. Because sometimes the true journey is not about escaping the unknown. It's about understanding that you cannot conquer it. You can only learn from it, listen, respect, and allow it to change you. And in that change, you find a strength far deeper than any courage born of ignorance. The forest had whispered, it had circled, it had tested me, and I had listened.